Chapter 20 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 20. Christmas in Alaska. Thursday, December 13th. The old Eskimo whom I call Grandpa came from the home with one of Mr. H's assistants for a load of supplies for the place, and arrived in time for breakfast at 9:30. They loaded up the sleds, took hot coffee, and started back at 11 in the morning. Mr. M came back alone before noon, having given up his trip to the Koyuk because his shoulder hurts him. The old horse had finally to be killed, and Mr. M decided that he did not want to take his place at hauling, so turned back after selling part of his supplies to the others. The weather is fine indeed. A little snow is falling this afternoon, but there was a beautiful sky at sunrise and sunset, the latter at 1:30. While giving Jenny her lesson today, I was introduced for the first time to little Charlie, who spends a good deal of time with Jenny. He is 4 years old and a bright and beautiful child. His papa is an Englishman, and his Eskimo mother is dead. After the lesson, I read stories to the two children, holding the little boy upon my lap, while Jenny sat beside us in the lamplight, her big black eyes shining like stars. She wore a brown serge dress, trimmed with narrow red trimming, her hair neatly braided in 2 braids down her back and tied with red ribbons. Both children wore little reindeer mucklucks on their feet, the boy being dressed in flannel blouse waist and knee pants. They are a very pretty pair of children. Such a charming, soft-tinted, red, purple, and blue sky today, stretching along in bars above the snow-topped mountains. It makes one glad to be here and feel full of pity for those who cannot enjoy it with us. It is good to enjoy everything possible as one goes along, for nobody knows how long anything will hold out and what will come next. At noon, 2 hungry Eskimo children came, dirty, forlorn, and cold, and we fed them. Mr. H came again toward evening with reindeer to get a load of supplies, and the girls and M went fishing. They had great sport, all dressed in fur, with short fish poles, hooks, bait, and gunny sack for the game, coming in frosty and rosy after dark, and calling for hot coffee. I am quite interested in getting the fox skins for my coat. I have paid the Eskimo girl $5 for tanning my fur skins, and hope to have a warm coat. My first 3 skins cost me $12, the next 2 $10, and now $5 for tanning. But I have a lining, and Molly will make it for me next week. After supper, we had a caller who has been here once before with others. He is a finely trained baritone singer and comes from one of the southern states. He sang and played entertainingly on the organ for an hour, while we sewed and knitted as we do each evening. Saturday, December 15th. 8 weeks today since we landed at Golovin Bay. Weather good, skies beautiful, but days are short. Sunset at 1:30 in the afternoon. Sunrise about 10 in the morning. The commissioner came with legal documents and customary jokes, and I try to get the copying done in between times. He is going to Nome for Christmas, and wants the papers all finished before he leaves. He is considered a very rapid young man, and looks like it. Sunday, December 16th. We had breakfast today at sunrise, 10 in the morning, and I went for a walk alone upon the ice in a southerly direction, where the natives were fishing. There was a good trail which has been made by a horse team hauling wood from the other shore, and the air was fine, so that I enjoyed it very much, though my hood was soon frosty around my face. For a while, I watched the natives haul tomcod up through the ice holes, but having no place to sit except upon the ice, as they did, I returned after having been gone 2 hours, and was soon dressed for dinner in Sunday suit. After dinner, Mr. H. arrived with the teacher to hold an evening service in the kitchen, the latter taking Ricka and Mary with her to call upon some native families, 2 of whose members were sick. When they returned, Ricka was full of laughter at the way they had entered the native igloos, especially Mary, who is a large woman and could barely squeeze in through the small opening called by courtesy a door. Ricka says it was more like crawling through a hole than anything else, and at one time Mary was so tightly jammed in that she wondered seriously how she was ever to get out. "Ah," said Ricka, when Mary related the incident, "that was not the worst of it. I wanted to keep the good dinner I had eaten, but the smell of the igloo almost made me lose it then and there, and as I was inside already, and Mary stuck fast in the door so that I could not get out, we were both in a bad plight. When I tried to help her, she would not let me, but only laughed at me." "Next time we'll send Mrs. Sullivan," said Alma, laughing. "And you go along with me," said I, knowing that I could stand as long as Alma the smell of the Eskimo huts and their seal oil. So that was settled. Miss J., I presume, thinking us all very foolish to make so much fuss over a little thing like that in Alaska. This evening, when the kitchen was filled with natives, their service had begun, and while some of us sat in the sitting room to leave more chairs for the others, there came a knock at the door, and in walked the commissioner and the young baritone singer, who was persuaded to sing a few solos after the meeting was through in the kitchen. Monday, December 17th. Molly is cutting my fur coat for me, but says I must have 1 or 2 more skins to make it large enough. She says she is too busy to study before Christmas, but will afterwards. The commissioner brought more copying for me to do, and told me I could have the money for my work at any time. Some tell me he never pays anything he owes, and that I must look sharp or I will not get anything. The other commissioner has invited me to go to a New Year's party at Council, 50 miles away, saying he will take me there and back behind his best dogs. But I refused, telling him that I never dance and that I'm a married woman. At that he laughed, said he was also married, with a wife in the States, but that does not debar him from having a good time. Word comes of a new gold strike not far away, but I think we are not really sure that it is bona fide, and must not put too much dependence on what we hear. The commissioner comes with his copying, and is full of jokes. Wednesday, December 19th. A man came from the home yesterday who has persuaded M to go with him on a short staking expedition. They think they know of a new find very near home, and I ran over to the recorders to get 2 attorney papers made out for them to take, as they say they will stake for the girls and me. The commissioner paid me $20 on copying, and said he would settle the remainder when he got back from Nome, as he and the other commissioner were just setting out with a dog team for that place. I have had to buy another fox skin for my coat, making $27 paid out on the garment thus far. Right sorry I was today that Mr. H. carried away the big velvet couch yesterday that I have slept on nights since coming here, and I tried last night the wooden settle brought down from upstairs to the sitting room. I found it a most uncomfortable thing to sleep on, as my feet hung at least 6 inches over the end of the lounge, and they were icy when I wakened in the morning. I then decided to go upstairs to one of the canvas bunks in the northeast room, and I find it much better every way. The bunk is long, wide and warm enough, with a reindeer skin under me, and all my blankets and comforters over me, while I have the room alone, temporarily at least. Saturday, December 22nd. This is the middle shortest day of winter, and a fine one, too, though we had not more than 3.5 hours daylight. The skies are beautiful, with many bright colors blended in a most wonderful way. The girls are hard at work cooking for Christmas, and while the boys were all away today and we needed wood brought into the house, I rigged myself in ragtime costume and fetched several loads in my arms. How the girls laughed when they saw me and declared they would fetch the kodak, but I ran away again. This afternoon, Em and the other man returned from their little trip, looking bright and happy over having staked some claims for themselves and us not very far away. These are our first claims staked, and we naturally feel more than usually set up, though the men say, of course, there may be nothing of value in them. When I went to give Jenny her lesson, I heard her father and another man talking of a party of 5 persons who have been taken out to sea on the ice near Topkok. They started about 3 days ago from here, and one was the sick woman who has been at the hotel, all on their way to Nome by dog team. There were 2 women and 3 men, 2 dog teams and sleds. They were crossing the ice between 2 points of land while upon the winter trail to Nome. The wind had loosened the ice, and when they tried to get upon shore again, they found it impossible, and they were blown directly out to sea. Without food or shelter, and with the nights as cold as they are, how can they live on the ice at sea? Some men have arrived bringing the news, and say that 2 men went out in a boat to their rescue, but broke their oars. The ice closed in on them, they were soaked through, and were obliged to use their best efforts to save themselves. The following night was very cold, and all think the unfortunates must have perished. What a terrible fate, and one that may happen to anyone traveling in this country, though it does seem as if this ice should soon freeze solidly. Sunday, December 23rd. Soon after breakfast today, a man came to our door asking for iodine, or remedies for a dog bite. A mad dog had rushed upon a man sleeping in a tent in the night and bitten him quite severely upon the hands and leg. Mary and I put on our furs immediately and started out with the man, who piloted us into a small saloon, where the poor fellow sat by the stove with a white and pinched face. Several other men were standing about, after having done all they could for the injured man, but Mary washed the torn flesh in strong carbolic acid water and tied it up in sterilized bandages, for which he seemed very thankful. The little saloon was neat and clean, containing a big stove, 6 or 8 bunks across the back end, and a long table, upon which were spread tin plates, cups, and spoons. A short bar ran along one side by the door. The men said that the mad dog had been shot immediately after the accident, but there were others around in the camp they feared. I could easily see that the injured man was badly frightened as to the after effects of the dog bite, and both Mary and I did all in our power to suggest away his fear, knowing well that this was as harmful as the injury. I told him that the missionary, Mr. H., had had a great deal of experience with such accidents, but never yet had seen a person thus bitten suffer from hydrophobia, which appeared to comfort him greatly. When we left the place, he seemed more cheerful, though still very pale, and Mary promised to come again to see him. He belongs to a party of 3 men bound for Koyuk River. The young man who sings so well sometimes at the mission is one of the 3, but the other I have not yet seen. Later on, Mary and I called upon Alice, the Eskimo girl, who lives with her mother near the hotel, and who is suffering with quinsy. I found Jenny and Charlie there, and took them out for a walk down on the beach, where the little girl's aunt was cutting ice. As we passed the A.E. store, I noticed a dog lying on the porch, having a bloody mouth, but as he lay quietly, I did not think much about it. After we had passed down the trail for a block or so, I heard a commotion behind us, and looking back, saw a young man rush out into the trail and shoot a dog, the one, as I afterwards learned, that I had seen on the porch. It had been mad and snapping around all day, but the men could not find it earlier, and the two little children and I had passed within a few feet of it without being conscious of danger. Mr. H. came in to supper, also two others from the camp of the shipwrecked people, 30 miles away to the east of us. At supper, one of the men offered to stake some claims for us over near their camp, where they think there is gold. They took our names on paper and said that after prospecting, if they found gold, they would let us into the strike before any others. They will remain overnight and leave early in the morning. Mr. H. and Mary called after supper to see the man who was bitten by the mad dog, and found him looking better and not so worried as this morning. His friend was playing on the banjo, and all were sitting quietly around the fire. Monday, December 24th. The two boys, G and B, came in late last evening, tired and hungry, from the Nome Trail, glad to arrive at home in time for Christmas. Early this morning, Mary dressed herself up hideously as Santa Claus, bringing a big box of presents in while we sat at the breakfast table and distributing them. Of course, there were the regulation number of fake packages containing funny things for the boys, but each one had a present of something, and I had a souvenir spoon just from Nome, an ivory paper knife of Eskimo make from the girls, and later a white silk handkerchief. Going into the sitting room after breakfast, we were met by the fumes of burnt cork, hair, or cotton, and upon inquiry were told that Santa Claus had had a little mishap. His whiskers had been singed by coming into contact with the lamp chimney, and that it had delayed matters somewhat until Ricka, his assistant, could find more cotton on the medicine shelves. But the end of all was hearty laughter and a jolly good time, an effort to forget, for the present, the day in our own homes thousands of miles away. This morning before noon, all in the mission went to the home to the Christmas tree and exercises, leaving me alone to keep house. The first time this has happened in Alaska. Mr. H. had left the dog teams, 2 reindeer and 3 sleds, with which they were to drive over, and a merry party they were. When they had gone, I worked for some time at getting the rooms in order, and making all as tidy and snug as possible, but I had no holly berries nor greens with which to decorate. All was snowy and white out of doors, and a cheerful fire inside was most to be desired. In the afternoon I gave Jenny her lesson as usual. I am invited to eat Christmas dinner tomorrow with Molly, the captain, and little Jenny, and shall accept. A good many in camp have been invited, I understand, and I am wondering what kind of a gathering it will be. Tuesday, December 25th. Christmas Day, and I was alone in the mission all night, so I had to build my own fires this morning. I did not get up until 10 o'clock, as it was cold and dark, and I had nothing especial to do. There is plenty of wood and water, and everything in the house, so I do not have to go out of doors for anything. By noon I had finished my work, put on my best dress, and sat down at the organ to play. I went over all the church music and voluntaries I could find at hand, read a number of psalms aloud, and as far as possible for one person, I went through my Christmas exercises. If a certain longing for things and people far away came near possessing me, I would not allow it to make me miserable, for longing is not necessarily unhappiness, and I had set my mind like a flint against being dissatisfied with my present state. With what knowledge I possess of the laws of autosuggestion, I have so far since my arrival in Alaska managed the ego within most successfully, and tears and discontent are not encouraged nor allowed. We are creatures of voluntary habits, as well as involuntary ones, and habitual discontent and discouragement, gnawing at one's vitals, are truly death-dealing. The study of human nature is, in Alaska, particularly interesting in these directions, to the one with his mind's eye open to such things, and I am resolved, come what will, that I will keep the upper hand of my spirit, that it shall do as I direct, and not harbor blues nor discouragement. About 2 in the afternoon, in came M and one of the visiting Swedes, after having walked from the home where they had attended the Christmas party, and they were well covered with icicles. I prepared a hot lunch for them, and ate something myself. Later, a native was sent by Molly to fetch me over to the hotel to dinner, it being dark, and as I was already dressed for the occasion, I went with him. When I arrived at the dining room, they were just seated at table, and the waiters were bringing in the first course. 25 persons sat at the Christmas board, at one end of which sat the captain as host with his wife and little Jenny at his left. At his right sat the young musician, who had entertained us at the Mission several times with his singing, and the storekeeper, but with a place between them reserved for me. After a quiet Christmas greeting to those around me, I took my seat, and the dinner was then served. A bottle of wine was ordered by the host for me, and brought by the waiter, who placed it with a glass beside my plate. At each plate there had already been placed the same accompaniments to the dinner, with which great care had been taken by the 2 French cooks in the kitchen, and upon which no expense had been spared by the captain, who was host. While the waiters were serving the courses, and conversation around the table near me became quite general, on the aside I studied the company. It was cosmopolitan to the last degree. Opposite me sat the hostess, Molly, with her little Jenny, dressed in their very best, the woman wearing a fashionable train skirt, pink silk waist, and diamond brooch, while the little child wore light tan cloth in city fashion, and looked very pretty. Below them sat the regular boarders at the hotel clerk, the bartender, miners, traders, and the woman who kept the saloon. The latter appeared about 30 years of age, dark, petite, and pretty, richly and becomingly gowned in garments which might have come along with her native tongue from Paris. On our side of the long table, and opposite this woman, sat the only other white woman besides myself present, and she with her husband, the 2 neighbors who had given us our first sleigh ride behind the gray horse. On this side sat more miners, and the few travelers who happened to be at the hotel at this time. The clerk next his employer, who sat at my right, and the musician on my left, completed the number of guests, with the exception of the one at the farther end of the board opposite the host. This was a young man in a heavy fur coat, his head drooping low over his plate. "Don't let H fall upon the floor, boys," said the captain, as he saw the pitiable plight of the young man. "Poor fellow! He has been celebrating Christmas with a vengeance, and it was too much for him evidently. It don't take much to knock him out, though, and this wine," taking up his wine glass and looking through the liquid it contained, "won't hurt a baby." "Do you never take wine?" politely inquired the musician of me, as he noticed that my wine glass remained untouched, and a glass of cold water was my only beverage. "I never do," said I firmly, but with a smile, as I noticed that both he and the gentleman at my right barely touched theirs, while others drank freely. "Waiter, bring Mellie another bottle of that wine," called the bartender from the other side of the table. "Those bottles don't hold nothin' anyway, and a woman who can't empty more'n one of 'em ain't much." And a second bottle was handed the female dispenser of grog, a connoisseur of long standing, and one who could stand up under as much as the next person. By this time, the woman opposite her was considerably along the road to hilarity, and shouts and laughter came from both, called forth by the jest of their companions alongside. Meanwhile, the dinner progressed. The turkey was bona fide bird, and not a few gull's bones from a tin-quart can, while the cake and ice cream with which my meal was ended were all that could be desired in Alaska. All voted that the cooks had done themselves proud, and no one could say that Christmas dinners could not be served in Chinook. Before rising from the table, at the close of the meal, toasts to the host and hostess were drunk by those at the bottles, and Christmas presents were distributed to many, principally to members of the family and from boarders of the house. There were silk handkerchiefs, red neckties, boiled shirts, and mittens, and in some instances moose-hide gloves and moccasins made by the Eskimo hostess herself, while Melly came in for a share, including a large black bottle of choice Burgundy. Upon leaving the dining table, the company separated, most of the men going into the barroom and store, while the family and invited guests repaired to the living room. Here a good-sized Christmas tree had been arranged for Jenny and Charlie, and their presents were displayed and talked over. In the meantime, the long dining table was cleared and spread again for the Eskimos, who soon flocked into the room in numbers. Someone proposed that we go to the mission and have some songs by the musician, to which all assented, and 9 of us, including the captain, his wife, and Jenny, started over about 8:30. There we found the rooms bright and warm, the 2 men keeping house in my absence, having escaped to the upper rooms on hearing the party approaching. Here a pleasant hour or two were passed in listening to the songs of the musician, who always accompanies himself on his instrument, whether banjo or organ. He sang "The Lost Chord," "Old Kentucky Home," and many other dear old songs, closing with "God be with you till we meet again," and the doxology. After that they pulled on their parkies and fur coats and went out into the snowstorm, for by this time the snow was falling heavily, and to their homes, while I sat down alone in the firelight to review the events of the day. My first Christmas day in Alaska. How different from any other I have ever spent. What a disclosure of the shady side of human nature this is. And yet, there is some good intermingled with it all. Many here cannot endure the stress of the current, nor pull against it, and so float easily on towards the rapids and destruction. Here is a field for the Christian worker, though Mr. H. says he moved his little flock 12 miles across the bay in order to get it farther away from this iniquitous camp. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 21. My First Gold Claims. Christmas is over for another year, and this is December 26th with its daily winter routine. After I had given the 2 men their breakfast, I went out for a walk upon the beach. A few snowflakes fell upon my face as I walked, and it was not cold, but pleasant. There was a red and glowing eastern sky, but no sunshine, and I looked out over the ice to see if possibly the girls were returning. Seeing nothing of them, I went home again. About 2:00, M came in, saying that they could be seen far out upon the ice, and we must build the fires and get dinner started, which we then did. Soon Alma came riding on a reindeer sled, with a native driver, getting in ahead of the others, who arrived half an hour later. Mr. H. has come with 2 of his assistants and Miss E., by reindeer team from the home on their way to the station, where the animals are herded in the hills, and all had a good lunch. After spending 2 hours in packing, talking, and resting, they left again, Miss E on a sled behind a reindeer, which was driven by a native, and which tore up the snow and clouds as he dashed over the ice northward to the hills. I ran out upon the cliff to see them on their way, being quite contented that it was not myself. I have learned that the 5 persons who drifted out to sea on the ice were brought back by the wind and tide, and escaped safely to land after being at sea several days, but were unharmed and went on to Nome. I was very glad to hear this, as they have had a narrow escape from death. Friday, December 28th. The musician and his friend who was bitten by the mad dog called this forenoon at the mission to get the man's wounds dressed by Mary, the nurse. His hands are much better, but the wounded leg may yet give him trouble. Mary did her best for the man, who seems to be growing more cheerful, and we do all possible to encourage and help him, lending him reading matter of various kinds with which to pass his time. A good many are going to the New Year's party at Council, among them the captain and his wife, and the musician, but I shall not go, though both commissioners have urged me to accept their invitations, and did not enjoy overmuch my refusals. I was playing ball with Jenny and Charlie before our lessons today, when the party started out with the dog teams, for the nights are very moonlight and clear, and they can travel for many hours. A cousin of Molly's, by name Agituck, went with her. Jenny is to stay with her auntie until her mamma's return, and I will give her the afternoon lessons just the same, only at her auntie's house. When the lesson was finished, I led Charlie to Agituck's house, where her mother cares for him in the night time, and left Jenny with her auntie, Apuk. This woman has a neat little cabin of 3 small rooms, furnished in comfortable fashion, with a pretty Brussels rug covering the floor of her best room, in which is a white iron bedstead, a good small table with a pretty cover, a large lamp, white dimity curtains at the windows over the shades, and in the next room there are white dishes upon the shelves. Sunday, December 30th. It is 10 weeks yesterday since we arrived at Golovin, or Chinook, as is the Eskimo name for the settlement, and pronounced Chinook, a creek of the same name flowing into the bay a mile east of this camp. During the day I went to look after Jenny and brought the child home with me, giving her candy and nuts, and playing for her on the organ. This evening we all went out upon the ice for a walk. We took the trail to White Mountain, going in a northwesterly direction, and enjoyed it very much. We passed the cliff and the boats, the snow creaking at every step, and the moonlight clear and beautiful. We were out for 2 hours, and felt better for the fresh air and exercise. All old-timers say that it is bad for one's health to remain indoors too much in Alaska, and people should get out every day for exercise. There is far more danger of getting scurvy by remaining in the house too much than from any kinds of food we have to eat, and none of us wish to be ill with that troublesome disease. About 5 o'clock, Miss E came in with a native from the station where the reindeer are kept, having grown tired of staying in a native hut with the Eskimo women while the missionary was busy at work. She started early this morning when the weather was fine. Lincoln, the experienced native who came with her, knew the way perfectly, and they expected to make the 12 or 15 miles and get into the mission early. But the weather suddenly changed, as it knows so well how to do in this country. The wind blew, snow fell and drifted, and though they came safely through the hills, they lost their way upon the bay while crossing to Chinook, and wandered for hours in the snowstorm. Having no lunch, tent, nor compass, and no extra furs, they found themselves in a disagreeable plight, especially as the snow was very soft and wet. They kept on traveling, however, until they were satisfied that they were going in circles, as do all when lost in a snowstorm, and were making no progress. Then they halted. Here they were overtaken by two white men, lost like themselves, who, when the matter had been talked over, would not follow the native, thinking they knew better than he the way to Chinik, and they went off by themselves. Miss E. says that both she and Lincoln had given up hope of getting here today, but she knelt upon the ice and prayed that they might find their way safely, then trusted that they would do so, and started. After going on for a time in the storm, they saw a small deserted cabin not far from them, which Lincoln instantly recognized as one upon the point of land only a quarter of a mile west of Chinik, and they were happy. They soon came into the Mission, full of gratitude, though wet, tired, and hungry, for it is so warm that there is water on the ice in places, and the snow is very heavy. They had only one deer with them. The two lost men came into camp an hour after Miss E. arrived, having gone past the cabin in camp and southward too far in their reckoning. It is never safe to travel without a compass of some sort in this country. Mr. H. and his two men have, besides attending to the herd, staked some gold claims while away, not far from our claims. The wind has died down, and there is no snow falling tonight at 8:30. This is New Year's Eve, and the girls and boys are singing and having a good time in the sitting room while I write. We are going to sit up to watch the old year out and the new year in, and have a little song service at midnight. This is the last day of 1900, and a memorable year it has been. How many new scenes and how great the changes through which we have passed. What will the new year bring? Where will we be next year at this time? It is probably better that we do not know the future. New Year's Day, 1901. This has been a good day all around, after our midnight watch meeting, when 7 of the 8 persons present took a part, and we sang many songs with the organ. At 12:30 I retired, but the others remained up until 2 o'clock. This evening the storekeeper and 2 others from White Mountain called to see if we did not care to go out coasting on the hill behind the Mission, and 5 or 6 of us went. When we got to the top of the hill, the wind was so strong that I could hardly stand, and after a few trips down the hill we gave it up, part of our number going out to walk upon the ice, and the rest of us going indoors. The men were invited into the Mission and stayed for an hour, chatting pleasantly, as there is no place for them to go except to the saloons. It is a great pity that there is no reading room with papers and books for the miners, with the long winter before them and nothing to do. There is a crying need for something in this line, and if they do not employ their time pleasantly and profitably, they will spend it unprofitably in some saloon or gambling place. I wish I had 1,000 good magazines to scatter, but I have none. I gave Jenny her lesson and amused both children for a time this afternoon. Yesterday the snow drifted badly, and I fear the people who went to council will not have a good trail on the way home. January 2nd. It is pleasant to have a corner by myself in which to write and be sometimes alone. The little northeast corner room where I sleep has a tile pipe coming up from the kitchen, making the room warm enough except in the coldest weather. It has a north window with no double one outside, and when the wind comes from the north, I expect it will be extremely cold. From this window I can see, when the glass is free from frost, out upon the trail to Nome and White Mountain. Today there is water on the ice, and it has been raining and blowing. 3 of the boys returned from a 4 days prospecting trip to the west, and as two of them had been sick the whole time since they left here, they came in wet, tired, and hungry, without having much good luck to relate. I told him it was something to get back at all again, and they agreed heartily, while eating a hot supper. An hour later, and Mr. H. with the visiting preacher came in from the reindeer station, and their staking trip, in the same condition as the three boys had been, so a supper for them was also prepared. Our kitchen looks like a junk shop these days, and a wet one at that, for the numbers of mucklucks, fur parkies, mittens, and other garments hung around the stove to dry are almost past counting, and the odor is stifling. But the clothing must be dried somewhere, and there is no other place. An engine room would be the very best spot I know for drying so many wet furs, and I wish we had one here. In speaking to one of the men today about prospecting my claim, I told him I would furnish the grub, but he said very kindly, "I wouldn't take any grub from you. I've got enough, and shall be at work there anyway, so it won't take long to sink some holes in your claim," which I thought was very good of him. I hope they will strike it rich. January 3rd. A wet, sloppy, snowy day, our January thaw, Mr. H. says. I took the two children out on the sled upon the ice and pushed at the handlebars until I was reeking with perspiration, afterwards giving Jenny her lesson at her auntie's. There are 12 of us under the mission roof tonight, including Miss E. and the native. January 4th. These are great days. We have a house full of men, 9 in all, and some are getting ready to leave tomorrow to do some staking of claims up near the station. M. said if the musician were only here and they could get a dog team, he would like to get him to go with him on a staking trip not far away. This man returned soon afterward, and M. wanted me to ask him if he would go. I did so, and he replied that he would go and furnish dogs if possible, but the ones he tried to get were engaged, and that plan fell through, much to his discouragement. Learning this, I determined to go to the captain at the hotel and see if I could procure dogs from him for the trip. He said yes, I could have his best dogs, and that a mail carrier is here resting who will lend us his dogs, so that was all arranged. Location papers then had to be written out, grub boxes packed, a tent looked up, and many things attended to before they left, so that others in camp got an inkling of what was being done and wanted to go along. Then M. and the musician decided to put off going until midnight, when they would sneak quietly out of camp with their dogs and scamper away among the hills without the others knowing it. But it could not be done, and 2 or 3 sleds followed them at midnight in the moonlight, as is the custom with Alaska stampeders. January 5th. Molly asked me today to go with her to visit her fox traps, and I immediately decided to go. We started about 1:30 in the afternoon, on foot past the cliff, but when we had gone a short distance, Molly stopped to call back to the house. Some native boys were cutting wood at the north door, and she motioned one to come to her. When he came, she spoke to him in Eskimo, and he, assenting to what she said, ran back again. "I tell Mookie to come with dog team, bring us home. You get tired by and by," she said thoughtfully, as we trudged on again over and through the snow. The woman wore a reindeer parkie, short skirt and mucklucks, and carried a gun on her shoulder. The snow was quite a foot deep, with a crust on top which we broke at almost every step, and which made it hard walking. On we mushed, past the cliff, the boats, and out upon the ice. The traps had been set by Molly a week before on the northeast shore of the bay among a few low bushes, and this was our objective point. When we reached the first trap, which was buried in snow, but found by a certain shrub which Molly had in some way marked and now recognized, I threw myself upon the snow to rest and watch her movements. Around us we saw plenty of ptarmigan tracks, but no signs of foxes. A foot below the snow surface, Molly found her trap and proceeded to reset it. Carefully covering the trap with a very little light snow and smoothing it nicely over, she chipped off bits of reindeer meat from a scrap she had brought with her, scattering them invitingly around. The scene about us was a very quiet one and wintry in the extreme. Long, low hills stretched out on every side of the bay, and the whole earth was a great snow heap. The sky and cloud effects were charming, fading sunshine on the hilltops making them softly pink, and very lovely, but with deep reddish purple tints over all as the sunball disappeared. One after another, 4 fox traps in different places were reset by Molly, while I mushed on behind her. At last we saw the dog team and Mookie coming on the bay. 5 dogs he had hitched to his sled, and each wore a tiny bell at its throat, making a pretty din as they trotted. When the woman had finished her trapping, we both climbed into the sled, the native running and calling to the dogs, and they started for home. It was not a long ride, probably not more than 1.5 miles as we went, but while tramping through the snow crust to the traps, it seemed much longer. I now thoroughly enjoyed the novel ride. In the dusky twilight, the dogs trotted cheerfully homeward, obeying the musical calls of their driver, and the little bells jingled merrily. Darker and more purple grew the skies until they tinted the snow over which we were passing, and by the time we had halted before the hotel door, it was really night. By the clock, it was 15 minutes past 4, and the thermometer registered 15 degrees below zero. Then we toasted our feet before the big heater, removed and shook out our frosty furs, and answered the 2 children's questions. To these Molly gave her explanations in Eskimo, and I told of the ptarmigan tracks I had seen on the snowdrifts. Sunday, January 6th. Yesterday I moved into the little southeast room which was formerly Miss J's. It has pretty paper on the walls and a small heater in one corner, besides a single cot, and I soon settled quite comfortably. The room with the bunks was needed for the men, of whom there are so many most of the time. The room I now have has a south window, but not a double one, and gets heavy with frost, which remains on the panes. But I can have a fire when I want one, as the stove burns chips and short wood, of which there are always quantities in the shed. B tells me to use all the wood I want, as there is no shortage of fuel, nor men to haul and cut it, which I think is very kind. A little fire while I am dressing nights and mornings, however, is all I shall try to keep burning. Miss J came with Ivan, bringing several native children to visit their parents for a few hours, but took them back with her after supper when the meeting was over, which she had held in the kitchen. We had 16 to supper, including natives. Afterward, we went down to the beach to see the party off for the home. Ivan led the dogs, 5 in number, hitched to the big sled. Miss J ran alongside, the visiting preacher at the handlebar, and the little children on the sled. After watching them off, we came home and then took a walk of 1 mile out upon the ice on the White Mountain Trail, which was in fairly good condition. There were 6 of us. When we got back to the house, I played by request on the organ for the 3 Swedish visitors from council. The weather is bright and beautiful, and 16 degrees below zero. Monday, January 7th. The boys came in from their stampede to the creeks, and M says they staked us all rich if there is anything good in the ground. My claim is number 10 below Discovery on H Creek, and sounds well, if nothing more. Of course, we women are all much elated and talk of our claims very glibly, but a few sunken prospect holes will tell the story of success or failure better than anything else. This has been a busy day in the house until I went at 2:30 in the afternoon to Molly's to find her ill in bed with a very bad throat. I gave Jenny and Charlie 2 hours of my time and went home, to return in the evening at Molly's request. The poor woman was suffering severely, and I did what I could for her, rubbing her throat with camphorated oil and turpentine, and wrapping it in thick, hot flannels. Then I assisted her to bed, rubbing her aching bones, and left her less feverish than when I went in. The thermometer is above zero and the weather is pleasant. 2 men from Topkok came in to see the recorder's books and searched all through them without finding what they wanted and expected to find, and then went away with sober and disappointed faces. Curses not loud but deep come to our ears each day about the Commissioner's work of recording, and many say he is now deep in dissipation at Nome, instead of attending here to his business as he should. Miners declare him unfitted in every way for his position and affirm that they will depose him from office. I went out this morning and bought a student lamp at the store, paying $6.50 for it. This, with my case of coal oil, will light my room nicely, besides giving a good deal of heat. The marshal and men are home from the Koyuk River after 4 weeks of winter mushing, and say nothing about their trip. They did not manage to pull harmoniously together, and Mr. L. returned before them. January 9th. When I went today to the hotel to teach my pupils, I found the men in the room cleaning the big heater, and ashes and dirt drove us out of the place. So we went upstairs to another room in which Molly sometimes sews, and where we found her at work on a white parkie for the musician. I played with Jenny for a time before the lesson, and Ageetuk came in on an errand, while Polly, the Eskimo servant, jabbered in a funny way and wobbled over the floor like a duck, as is her habit when walking. This girl is short, fat, and shapeless, with beady black eyes and a crafty expression, certainly not to be relied on if there is truth in physiognomy. At the hotel, all is excitement and bustle, getting the men off for the Kuskokwim River, where the new strikes are reported. Strong new sleds have been made by the natives, grub is being packed, and dogs gotten into condition, besides 1,000 other things which must be done before the expedition is ready to start. Seeing them make such extensive preparations reminded me that perhaps I might get the men to carry my paper and stake something for me, so plucking up my courage, I asked the promoter of the expedition, whom I know, if I could do this, and was readily given permission. In a few minutes, paper, pen, and ink were brought in, a clerk was instructed to draw up the paper in proper shape, which he did, and it was signed and witnessed in due form, Molly subscribing her name as one of the witnesses. For this I tendered my heartiest thanks, and ran home with a light heart, already imagining myself a lucky claim owner in a new and rich gold section on the Kuskokwim. The party of 5 men are to leave tomorrow morning for the long trip of several hundred miles over the ice and snow. Molly advises me to have another pair of mucklucks made smaller, and to keep these I am wearing for traveling, when I will wear more inside them. So I will take my materials over tomorrow, and she will have Alice cut and sew them for me. I hope they will not make my feet look so clumsy as do these, my first ones. January 10th. This was a cold and windy morning, so the men at the hotel could not start out for the Kuskokwim as they intended. Some men came to the mission to see if they could rent the old schoolhouse to live in, the doctor and his plucky little wife having left some weeks ago for a camp many miles east of Chinik. After looking it over, the men have concluded to take it and move in soon. There are no buildings to buy or rent in this camp, nor anything with which to build, so it is hard lines for strangers coming to Chinik. This afternoon, Alma went over with me to the hotel to stitch on Molly's sewing machine, and I carried the deerskin for my new footgear, which Alice will make acceptably, no doubt, as she is very expert. Mr. H., 2 natives and 2 white men were here to supper tonight on their way to Nome by dog team, and are wishing to start at 3 in the morning in order to make the trip in 2 days. M. and L. are also here, so we had 7 men to supper. We had fried ham, beans, stewed prunes, tea, and bread and butter. This morning it was 2 degrees below zero, with a strong cold wind. Tonight it is 14 degrees below zero with no wind, and is warmer now than then. No moonlight till nearly morning, but the stars shine brightly. January 11th. Mary sat up all night baking bread and starting the men off for Nome between 3 and 4 in the morning. I got up at 9 o'clock and enjoyed the magnificent sunrise. I went out with Ricka while she tried at the 3 stores to find a lining for her fur coat, but one clerk told us that no provision for women was made by the companies, and they had nothing on their shelves she wanted. At the hotel store she found some dark green calico at 25 cents a yard, which she was obliged to take for her lining. While I gave Jenny her lesson, her mother came from her hunting and had shot 6 ptarmigan, having hurt her finger on the trigger of the gun. Molly studies a little while each day when Jenny has finished her lesson. There is a sick Eskimo woman here now, who was brought in from the reindeer camp yesterday, and Molly has her upstairs in the sewing room on a cot. Mary, the nurse, went over with me to see her and says she has rheumatic fever. She seems to be suffering very much and cannot move her hands or limbs. January 12th. At 8 o'clock today, the thermometer stood at 41 degrees below zero, but registered 32 degrees during the middle of the day, and the houses are not so warm as they have been. When I called for Jenny at the hotel today, I found her crying with pain in her leg, so she could not take a lesson, but I sent out for little Charlie, who came running to me with outstretched arms. He is a dear little child, and I am getting very fond of him. It is some weeks since Jenny first began crying occasionally with pain, and her parents cannot understand it unless it is caused by a fall she had on the steamer coming from San Francisco last summer, and of which they thought nothing at the time. I sincerely hope she is not going to be very ill, with no doctor nearer than White Mountain. The sick woman still suffers, though they are doing what they can for her. The captain requested me to bring our medical books over, or send them, that he can look up remedies and treatment of rheumatic fever, for that is what she no doubt has. While seated at the organ an hour later, in came the storekeeper and his clerk, followed soon after by the captain and musician. Then we had music and solos by the last named gentleman, and the knitting needles kept rapidly flying. At 11 o'clock, they went out into the intense cold, which sparkled like diamonds, but which pinched like nippers the exposed faces and hands. Here is another cold, quiet day, with the thermometer at 35 degrees below zero, and it is a first-class one to spend by the fire. We have read, slept, eaten, and fed the fires, with only 1 man, 3 girls, and myself in the house. At 10 in the evening, G and B came in from a 5 days mushing trip on the trails, being nearly starved and frozen. They were covered with snow and icicles, their shirts and coats stiff with frost from steam of their bodies, as they ran behind the sled to keep warm. A hot supper of chicken, canned, coffee, and bread and butter was prepared in haste for them, and they toasted themselves until bedtime. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 22. The Little Sick Child. The winter is rapidly passing, and so far without monotony, though what it will bring to us before spring remains to be seen. Little Jenny has been suffering more and more with her leg of late, and her papa sent for the doctor at White Mountain, who came today by dog team. The child's mother has had a spring cot made for her, and she was put to bed by the doctor, who says the knee trouble is a very serious one, and she must have good nursing, attention being also paid to her diet. The Eskimos are all exceedingly fond of seal and reindeer meat, and Jenny's Auntie Apuk, or grandmother, will often bring choice tidbits to the child at bedtime, or between meals, when she ought not to eat anything, much less such hearty food. When the little child sees the good things, she of course wants them, and having been humored in every whim, she must still be, she thinks, especially when she is ill. A problem then is here presented, which I may help to solve for them. Jenny and I are growing very fond of each other, and she will do some things for me which she will not do for others who have obeyed her wishes so long. I begin by roundabout coaxing and reasoning, and get some other idea into her mind, until the plate of seal meat is partially forgotten, and does not seem so attractive at 9 in the evening as when presented with loving smiles by her old grandmother, who does sometimes resent the alternative, but is still exceedingly solicitous that the little girl should recover. As grandmother understands English imperfectly, Molly is obliged to reiterate the doctor's orders in Eskimo, making them as imperative as possible, and the poor old Eskimo woman goes home with the promise that Jenny shall have some of the dainties at mealtime on the morrow. In appearance, grandmother is still somewhat rugged, being a large woman with an intelligent face, which expresses very forcibly her inner feelings, and being probably somewhere between 60 and 70 years of age. Her husband, who has been dead only a year or two, was much beloved by her, and no reference to him is ever made in her presence, without a flow of tears from her eyes. Her love of home and kindred seems very strong, and her devotion to little Jenny amounts almost to idolatry, so the solicitude expressed by the good woman is only a part of what she really feels, but which is shown in hundreds of ways. When the doctor settled the little girl in her bed, she adjusted a heavy weight to the foot on the limb, which has given her so much trouble, and now the grief of Molly and her mother is unbounded. Poor old grandmother wipes her eyes continually, leaving the house quickly at times to rush home and mourn alone, as she is so constrained to do, her sorrow for her darling's sufferings being very sincere. Later she comes in after doing her best at courage building, tiptoes her way in to see if her pet is sleeping or awake, and bringing something if possible, with which to amuse or interest the invalid. However great is the grief of the women, that of the child's papa is equally sad to see, and he, poor man, is forced to face the probability of a long and dreary winter, if not a lifetime of suffering for his darling child. One cannot help seeing his misery, though he tries like a Trojan to hide it, and keeps as cheerful as possible to encourage others. He is always an invalid himself. The main topic of interest to Jenny now is the little stranger who has come to live with her Auntie Apuk, and whom she is so desirous of seeing that she almost forgets her trouble and suffering, asking constantly about its size, color, eyes, hair, hands, and feet. She counts the days before she can see it, and puzzles greatly over the fact of its not possessing a name. her big black eyes getting larger and blacker as she wonders where one will be found. Little Charlie is allowed in to see Jenny at times and wonders greatly to find her always in bed, asking many questions in his childish Eskimo treble and patting her hand sympathetically while standing at her side. "Mama," said he the other day to Molly in Eskimo, with a pleased smile on his face, and when the two were alone, "the lady loved me." "How do you know?" asked Molly. "Because," he said shyly, putting his little arms about her neck, "because she kissed me." Whereupon Molly did the same, and assured him of her own love, always providing, of course, that he was a good boy and did what Papa and Mama told him to do. This conversation Molly reported to me a few days after it took place, and I assured her with tears welling up in my eyes that the little child had made no mistake. Strange action of the subjective mind of one person over another, even to the understanding by this Eskimo baby of a stranger heart, and that one so unresponsive as mine. The child, deprived as he was of an own mother's love, still hungered and thirsted for it, and he was quick to discern in my eyes and voice the secret for which he was looking. How I should enjoy giving my whole time to these two children, and they really do need me to teach and care for them. But I am dividing myself between them and the mission, and the winter days are very short. The thermometer today registered 14 degrees below zero, against 28 yesterday, and 30 below the day before that. Mr. H. has returned from Nome, bringing me a package of Kodak films sent from Oakland, California, last August, and which I never expected to receive after so long a time. I was delighted to get them, and now I can Kodak this whole district above and below. Molly is trying to study English a little, but with many interruptions on every hand. The big living room is light and warm, our only study place, and yet the rendezvous of all who care to drop in, regardless of invitations, making it somewhat difficult for us to concentrate our attention on the lessons. The marshal, the bartender, the clerks, cooks, miners, natives, strangers, and all come into this room to chat, see and inquire for Jenny, play with Charlie, and get warm by the fire. Here is an opportunity of a lifetime to study human nature, and I am glad, for it is a subject always full of interest to me, though I frequently feel literally choked with tobacco smoke and wish often for a private sitting room. Sunday, January 20th. We are snuggled indoors by the fires under the most terrible blizzard of the season so far, with furious gales, falling and drifting snow, and intense cold. It is impossible to keep the house as warm as usual, and I have eaten my meals today dressed in my fur coat, my seat at table being at the end with my back close to the frosty north window. Though this is the place of honor at the board, and the missionary's seat when he eats in the mission, still it is a chilly berth on occasions, and this is decidedly one. The dining room contains, besides the north window, one on the south side as well, and though both are covered with storm windows, the frost and ice is several inches thick upon the panes, precluding any possibility of receiving light from either quarter unless the sun shines very brightly indeed, and then only a subdued light is admitted. During the night the house shook constantly in the terrific gale, rattling loose boards and shingles, and I was kept awake for several hours. At night I am in the habit of tossing my fur coat upon my bed for the warmth there is in it, as I am not the possessor of a fur robe, as all persons should be who winter here. Furs are the only things to keep the intense cold out in such weather as we are now having. but with some management I get along fairly well. A reindeer skin not in use from the attic makes my bed soft and warm underneath. My coat over my blankets answers the same purpose, and the white fox baby robe from the old wooden cradle upstairs makes a soft, warm rug on the floor upon which to step out in the morning. Wool slippers are never off my feet when my mucklucks are resting, and I manage by keeping a supply of kindlings and small wood in my box by the stove to have a warm fire by which to dress. These days we do not often rise early, and 10 o'clock frequently finds us at breakfast. But we retire correspondingly late, and midnight is quite a customary hour lately. Today we pass the time in eating, sleeping, singing, and reading. A visiting Swedish preacher came over a few days ago from the home and is stormbound in the mission. He is a large, heavy man with a hearty voice and hand grip, and is a graduate of Yale College, using the best of English, having filled one of the vacant gnome pulpits for several weeks last fall before coming to Golovin. Today he has read one of Talmage's sermons to us, and we have sung gospel songs galore, in both Swedish and English, with myself as organist. When this is tired of, the smaller instruments are taken out, and Rika has the greatest difficulty in preventing Alma from amusing the assembled company with her mandolin solo, "Johnny, Get Your Hair Cut," the young lady's red lips growing quite prominent while she insists upon playing it. "Good music is always acceptable, Rika, and on Sunday as well as on any other day, so I cannot see why you will not let me play as I want to. I do not think it a sin to play on the mandolin on Sunday. Do you, Pastor F.?" asked Alma of the preacher, appealingly and in all innocence. What could he say to her? He laughed. "Oh, no," said Rika. "I do not say that mandolin music is sinful on Sunday, and if you would play 'Nearer, My God, to Thee,' or some such piece, and not play Johnny, I should not object." And she now looked at the preacher and me for reinforcements. Alma is not, however, easily put down, and the contest usually winds up with Rika going into the kitchen, where she cannot hear the silly strains of Johnny, which Alma is picking abstractedly from the strings of the instrument, while the preacher continues his reading, and I go off to my room. Mr. Q, a Swedish missionary, and his native preacher called Rock, have arrived from Unalaklik with the two visiting preachers at the home, and they held an evening service in the schoolhouse, which was fairly well attended. There were 7 white men, the 3 women in this house, and myself, besides many natives of both sexes. Grandmother was there with Alice, Aggie Tuck and others, and the missionary spoke well and feelingly in English, interpreted by Rock into Eskimo. One of the preachers sang a solo and presided at the organ. Some of the native women present had with them their babies, and these, away from home in the evening, contrary to their usual habit, cried and nestled around a good deal, and had to be comforted in various ways, both substantial and otherwise, during the evening. But the speakers were accustomed to all that, and were thankful to have as listeners the poor mothers, who probably could not have come without the youngsters. Considerable willpower and autosuggestion is needed to enable me to endure the fumes of seal oil, along with other smells which are constantly arising from the furs and bodies of the Eskimos, made damp perhaps by the snow which is lodged upon them before entering the room. Fire we must have. Those who are continually with the natives in these gatherings do get acclimated, but I am having a hard struggle along these lines. The 3 Swedish and 1 Eskimo preacher left today for the home, after I had taken a Kodak view of them and their dog team. As the wind blew cold and stiffly from the northwest, they hoisted a sail made of an old blanket upon their sled. There are many who are ingenious, and who are glad to help the sick child, Jenny, pass her time pleasantly, and among them is the musician. Being a clever artist as well as musician, he goes often to sit beside Jenny, and then slate and pencils are brought out, and the drawing begins. Indian heads, Eskimo children in fur parkies, summer landscapes, anything and everything takes its turn upon the slate, which appears a real kaleidoscope under the artist's hands. Jenny often laughs till the tears run down her face at some comical drawing or story, or the musician's efforts to speak Eskimo as she does, and both enjoy themselves immensely. Yesterday, Molly went out to hunt for ptarmigan. She is exceedingly fond of gunning, has great success, and she and the child relish these tasty birds better than anything else at this season. Ageetuk is also a good hunter and trapper, and brought in 2 red foxes from her traps yesterday, when she came home from her outing with Molly. Little Charlie ran up to Molly on her return from her hunt, and cried in a mixture of Eskimo and English, "Foxes, Peeluk, Mama," meaning to ask if she did not secure any animals, appearing disappointed when told by his mamma, for such she calls herself to the child, that she did not find anything today but ptarmigan. It was 20 degrees below zero this morning, and the sun was beautifully bright. The days are growing longer, and it is quite light at 8 o'clock in the morning. The short days have never been tiresome to me, because we have not lacked for fuel and lights and have kept occupied. One of the commissioners and 2 or 3 other men have been trying for a long time to get their meals here, but the girls have pleaded too little room and other excuses, until now the commissioner has returned and renewed his request. Today he came over and left word that he and 2 others would be here to 6 o'clock supper, at which the girls were wrathy. "I guess he will wait a long time before I cook his meals for him," sputtered Alma, who disliked the coming of the official to the house, and under no consideration would she consent to board him. "My time is too short to cook for a man like that," declared Mary, with a toss of her head, as she settled herself in the big armchair in the sitting room. And poor Ricka, whose turn it was this week to prepare the meals, found herself in the embarrassing position of compulsory cook for at least 2 of the men she most heartily despised in the camp, and this too under the displeasure of both Alma and Mary. "What shall I do?" groaned Ricka, appealing to me in her extremity. "Will you sit at the table with them tonight, Mrs. Sullivan? Because Alma and Mary will not, and I must pour the coffee. Oh dear, what shall I have for supper?" And the poor girl looked fairly bowed down with anxiety. "Oh, never mind them, Ricka," said I. "Just give them what you had intended to give the rest of us. I suppose they think this is a roadhouse, and if so, they can as well board here as others. But if Alma refuses to take them, I do not see what they can do but keep away," argued I, knowing both Alma and Mary too well by this time to expect them to change their verdict, as indeed I had no desire for them to do. "I'm sure it is not a roadhouse for men of their class," growled Alma, biting her thread off with a snap, for she was sewing on Molly's dress and did not wish to be hindered. "I'll not eat my supper tonight till they have eaten. Will you, Mary?" "Indeed I will not," was the reply from a pair of very set lips, at which Ricka and I retired to the kitchen to consult together and prepare the much talked of meal. Then I proceeded to spread the table with a white cloth and napkins, arrange the best chairs, and make the kitchen as presentable as I could with lamps, while Ricka went to work at the range. We had a passable supper, but not nearly so good as we usually have, for the official had not only taken us by surprise, but had come unbidden and was not, by the express orders of the business head of the restaurant firm, to be made welcome. At any rate, Ricka and I did the best we could under the circumstances. The meal passed in some way, and the official then renewed his request to be allowed to take all his meals in the mission, meeting with nothing but an unqualified refusal, much to his evident disappointment. I doubt very much now the probability of my getting any more copying to do for him, as he says I could have persuaded Alma to board him if I had been so inclined. But then I never was so inclined, and have about decided that I do not want his work at any price. January 25th. This has been a very cold, windy day, but 3 of the men came in from prospecting on the creeks, and have little to report. To think of living in tents, or even native igloos, in such weather for any length of time whatever, is enough to freeze one's marrow, and I think the men deserve to strike it rich to repay them for so much discomfort and suffering. Mr. L. and B. walked to the home and back today, 24 miles in the cold. I bought 2 more fox skins of the storekeeper with which to make my coat longer. Mr. H. and Miss J. came to hold a meeting in the kitchen for the natives, and Molly interpreted for them, as Ivan was not present. They all enjoy singing very much, and are trying to learn some new songs. Contrary to my expectations, they learn the tunes before they do the words, which are English, of course. Later, the musician came over and sang and played for an hour and a half at the organ, which all in the house enjoyed. But he is worried about his friend, who was bitten by the mad dog, and is in poor health, he told us tonight. They have lately moved into the old schoolhouse, and liked there better than their former lodgings, which were very cold. There are 3 of them in the schoolhouse, or rather cabin, for it is an old log building, with dirt roof, upon which the grass and weeds grow tall in summer, and under the eaves of the new schoolhouse, a frame structure with a small pointed tower. Sunday, January 27th. The missionaries held a meeting in the sitting room this forenoon, at which the commissioner was present, not because he was interested in the service, Alma says. I suppose he had nothing else to do, and happened to get up earlier than usual. I presided at the organ, and Miss J. led the singing. The day was a very bright one, but the thermometer registered 30 degrees below zero. The missionaries have taken Alma with them to visit for a few days, and do some sewing at the home. We all ran out upon the ice with them, but did not go far, as it was very cold. For a low mercury, these people do not stay indoors, but go about as they like, dressed from top to toe in furs, and do not suffer, but let the wind blow a stiff gale, and it is not the same proposition. 4 men came from the camp of the shipwrecked people, the father of Frida, the little girl, being one. They say the child and her mother are well, and as comfortable as they can be made for the present, but in the spring they will go back to Nome. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 23. Lights and Shadows of the Mining Camp. Again the boys are starting for the Koyuk River country. Although it is the 28th of January, and between 25 and 30 degrees below zero, nothing can deter Mr. L., who has made up his mind to go to the headwaters of the big river regardless of weather. L., B., and a native are to compose the party, and this time they are going with reindeer. They will take with them a tent, stove, fur sleeping bags, matches, grub, guns and ammunition, not to mention fry pans and a few tins for cooking purposes. Then they must each take a change of wearing apparel in case of accident, and make the loads as light as possible. B has made it a point to look well at his guns and cartridges, and has been for days cleaning, rubbing, and polishing, while hunting knives have also received attention. The party may have, in some way, to depend upon these weapons for their lives before their return. January 29th. 25 degrees below zero, but without wind, and the boys have started off on their long trip up the Koyuk. The reindeer were fresh and lively, and when everything was loaded and lashed upon the 3 sleds, the animals were hitched to them, when, presto! The scene was changed in a moment. Each deer ran in several directions at the same time as if demented, overturning sleds and men, tossing up the snow like dust under their hoofs, and flinging their antlers about like implements of battle. Now each man was put to his wits' end to keep hold of the rope attached to the horns of the deer he was driving, and we who had gone out upon the ice to watch the departure feared greatly for the lives of the men interested. At one time Mr. H., who was kindly assisting, was flung upon the ground, while a rearing, plunging animal was poised in mid-air above him, and I uttered a shriek of terror at the sight, thinking he would be instantly killed. However, he was upon his feet in an instant and pursuing the animals, still clinging to the rope, as the deer must never, under any consideration, be allowed to get away with the loaded sleds. When one of the boys attempted to sit upon a load, holding the rope as a guide in his hands, there would be a whisk, a whirl, and quicker than a flash over would go the load, sled and man, rolling over and over like a football on a college campus. At this time the sun shone out brightly, tinting rosily the distant hills, and spreading a carpet of light under our feet upon the ice-covered surface of the bay. The clear, cold air we breathed was fairly exhilarating, sparkling like diamonds in the sunbeams, and causing the feathery snowflakes under our feet to crackle with a delightful crispness. When the elasticity of the reindeer's spirits had been somewhat lessened by exercise, a real start was made, and we watched them until only small dots on the distant trail could be distinguished. Something unpleasant has happened. M., the Finlander, told me this morning that he wants the room I occupy upstairs, and, of course, I will have to give it up. As the other rooms upstairs must be left for the men, of whom there are such numbers, there is no place for me except on the old wooden settle in the sitting room. To be sure, this is in a warm corner, but there are many and serious inconveniences, one being that I must, of necessity, be the last one to retire, and this is usually midnight. For some time past I have been turning over in my mind the advisability of asking for the situation of nurse and teacher to Jennie and Charlie, and living in the hotel. Supplies are growing shorter in the mission as the weeks go by, and my own are about exhausted, as is also my money. The children need me, and there is plenty of room in the hotel, though I am not fond of living in one. I have consulted Mr. H., who sees no harm in my doing this if I want to. Meals are $1 each everywhere in Chinik, and most kinds of grub $1 a pound, while for a lodging the same is charged. To earn my board and room in the hotel by teaching and taking care of the 2 children, I should be making an equivalent to $4 a day, and I could have a room, at last, to myself. This is the way I have figured it out. Whether Mollie and the captain will see it in the same light remains to be seen. Later, I ran over to see Mollie and her husband, and to present my plan to them. They both assented quickly, the captain saying he does not want Jenny to stop her studies, and she is fond of having me with her. Besides, her mother wants to spend a good deal of time out hunting and trapping, as she thinks it better for Jenny, Charlie, and herself to have fresh game, of which they are so fond, than to eat canned meats. I think it is better for them, and shall not object to some of the same fare myself when it is plenty. I am very glad, indeed, of the opportunity to earn my board and room in this way, for my work will only be with and for the two children, and I love them very much. January 30th. A bad storm came up this afternoon with wind and snow. At the mission, one of the newcomers is making 2 strong reindeer sleds. He says he is used to Alaska winters, has been up to the Kotzebue Sound country, and is now going again with reindeer as soon as his sleds are finished. He is exceedingly fond of music and enjoys my playing. I wonder if he will offer to stake a claim for me. I will not ask him. January 31st. This terrible storm continues with snow drifting badly, and with wind most bitter cold. What about the boys on the Koyuk Trail? I fear they will freeze to death. I have finished 6 drill parkies for the storekeeper, but cannot get them to him in the blizzard. February 1st. I found when calling upon Jenny today that her mother was sick in bed with a very bad throat, so I spent most of the day and evening there. I did all I could for Jenny as well as Molly, doing my best to amuse the child, who is still strapped down on her bed, and must find the day long, though she has a good deal of company. I had a first-class 6 o'clock dinner at the hotel tonight, that is for Alaska at this season of the year. February 2nd. This is my birthday, and I've been thinking of my dear old mother so far away, who never forgets the date of her only daughter's birth, even if I do. I should like to see her, or, at least, have her know how well I am situated, and how contented I am, with a prospect before me which is as bright as that of most persons in this vicinity. If I could send my mother a telegram of a dozen words, I think they would read like this: I am well and happy, with fair prospects. God is good. I think that would cheer her considerably. It is beginning to seem a little like spring, and the water is running down the walls and off the windows in rivers upon the floors of the mission, which we are glad are bare of carpets, the snow having sifted into the attic and melted. The warm rain comes down at intervals, and we are hoping for an early spring. Molly is really very sick and must have a doctor, her throat being terribly swollen on one side. The pain and fever is intense, and though we are doing all we know how to do, she gets no better. Some men started out for the doctor at White Mountain, but there was too much water on the ice and they returned. February 6th. The man who made the 2 reindeer sleds for his Kotzebue trip has gone at last with 2 loads and 3 reindeer. He wanted his drill parkie hood bordered with fur, as I had done some belonging to others, and I furnished the foxtails and sewed them on for him. Shall I stake a claim for you? Asked the man with a smile the day before he left the mission. Oh, I would like it so much, said I, really delighted. I did not wish to ask you because I thought you had promised so many. So I have, he replied. But I guess I can stake for 1 more, and if I find anything good, I will remember you. Shall I have a paper made out? I inquired, feeling it would be safer and better from a business point of view to do so. You may if you like, I will take it, said he, and I thanked him very cordially and hastened to the commissioner to have the paper drawn up. It did not take long, and the man has taken it and gone. Being an old mail carrier and stampeder of experience in this country, he ought to know how to travel, and being a Norwegian, he is well used to the snow and the cold. He says he always travels alone, though I told him he might sometime get lost in a storm and freeze to death, at which he only laughed, and said he was not at all afraid. 2 years afterwards, he was frozen to death on the trail near Teller City, northwest of Nome. He was an expert on snowshoes or ski, both of which he learned to use when a boy in Norway. February 10th. The two young men, B and L, have returned from the Koyuk trip, having been able to travel only 3 days of the 11 since they left here, on account of blizzards, but they will not give it up in this way. Molly and Jenny are better, the doctor having been here 2 days. For the little invalid there is nothing of such interest as Apuk's baby, and as the child is well wrapped and brought in often to see her, she is highly delighted. She holds the baby in her arms and hushes it to sleep as any old woman might, lifting a warning finger if one enters the room with noise, for fear of waking it. Little Charlie cries with whooping cough a great deal and is taken to Ageetuk's house when he gets troublesome, as he worries both Molly and Jenny. Under no consideration is Charlie to come near enough to Jenny to give her the whooping cough, for she coughs badly already. She and I make paper dolls by the dozen, and cloth dresses for her real dolls, which, so late in the season, are getting quite dilapidated, and look as though they had been in the wars. Many natives are now bringing beautiful furs into camp for sale, and among others, one man brought a cross fox which was black, tipped with yellow, another which was a lovely brown, and a black fox valued at $200, which the owner refused to sell for less, though offered $100 for it. I have never seen more lovely furs anywhere, and I longed to possess them. It seems almost like having a hospital here now, for we have another patient added to our sick list. Joe the cook is ill, and thinks he will die, though the doctor smiles quizzically as she doses him, thinking as she does so that a few days in bed and away from the saloons will be as beneficial as her prescriptions. Today the hills surrounding the bay were lovely in the warm sunshine both morning and evening, pink tinted in the sunrise and purple as night approached. Mail came in by dog team from Nome, going to Dawson and the outside, so I mailed several letters. I wonder if they will be carried 2,000 miles by dogs, the whole length of the Yukon, and finally reach Skagway and Seattle. What a wicked world this is anyway. My 2 fox skins were stolen from the living room of the hotel last night, where I hung them, not far from the stove after having had them tanned, and forgetting to take them to my room. I can get no trace of them, and am exceedingly sorry to lose them. The captain thinks the skins will be returned, but I do not. The commissioner from council came into the hotel, and he, with the resident official, proceeded to celebrate the occasion by getting uproariously drunk, or going, as it is here called, on a toot, which is very truthfully expressive, to say the least. February 18th. The doctor went home several days ago. Molly is better, and wore at the Sunday dinner yesterday her new gray plaid dress made by Alma, which fits well and looks quite stylish. I sat with her at the long table, which was filled with guests, employees, and boarders, a public place for me, which I do not like overmuch, but what can I do? The 2 commissioners are sobered, look sickly, and more or less repentant. the resident official declaring to me he would now quit drinking entirely and buy me a new silk dress if he is ever seen to take liquor again. I had nothing to say to him except to look disgusted, and he took that as a rebuke. The other commissioner was exceedingly polite to me when he came into the living room to bid all goodbye, and said if at any time there was anything in the way of business transactions he could do for me, to let him know. He would be delighted. As if I would ever ask any favor of him. The weather is blustery, like March in Wisconsin. Molly asked me to go upstairs with her, look at rooms, and select one for myself, which I did, deciding to take a small, unfurnished one, except for a spring cot, mirror, and granite wash bowl and pitcher, as this will be easily warmed by my big lamp, and it has a west window through which I will get the afternoon sun. I cleaned the floor and tacked up a white tablecloth, which I had in my trunk, for a curtain, spread my one deerskin rug upon the floor, made up the cot bed with my blankets, opened my trunk, hung up a few garments, and was settled. This is the first spring bed I have slept upon since Mr. H. took the velvet couch away from the mission. I found the boarded walls very damp, as was also the floor after cleaning, but my large lamp, kept burning for 2 hours, dried them sufficiently, and I am quite well satisfied. Ageetuk has been papering the sewing room with fresh wallpaper, and it looks better, but it has made a good deal of confusion all round, and there are numbers of people, both native and white, coming and going all day long. February 23rd. Yesterday was Washington's birthday, but quiet here. Today Molly and I took Jenny and Charlie out on a sled with Mookie to push behind at the handlebar through the soft, deep snow. Molly sat upon the sled and rode downhill twice with the children, Mookie hopping on behind, but I took a few Kodak views of them, which I hope will be good. I also received some mail from the outside which was written last November. Some of the men in the hotel have tried to play what they call a joke on me. The steward of the house has a key which unfastens the lock on my door as well as others. So they went into my room and tied a string to the foot of my bed, first boring a hole through the boards into the hall, and running the string through it. This string, I suppose, they intended to pull in the night and frighten me, but Molly and I happened to go up there for something and found it. I was indignant, but everybody of whom Molly inquired denied knowing anything of it, and I said very little. Going to my trunk afterwards, I found that the lock had been picked and broken. A pretty severe joke, and one I do not relish, as now I have no place in which to keep anything from these men. If they enter my room whenever they choose in the daytime, what is to prevent them when I am asleep? I took Molly upstairs and showed her the broken lock, and she stooped to brush some white hairs from her dark wool skirt. "Where'd they come from?" she asked suddenly. Then, picking at the reindeer skin upon the floor under her feet, she said, nodding her head decidedly, "I know, he, Sim, come to me in sewing room. Hair all same this on 2 knees of black pants. I say, where you get white reindeer hair on you, Sim? He say, I don't know. Sim make hole in wall. And string on bed for you, Mrs. Sullivan. He make lock pillock too." And Molly's face wore a serious and worried expression. "Oh, well, Molly," said I, "don't worry. I shall say nothing to any of the men, as they are mad at me now." Molly nodded significantly and said, "Your fox skins pillock, Mrs. Sullivan. Sim knows where. He never tell. Sell for whiskey, maybe." And Molly turned to go, as though he were a hopeless case and beyond her government. Yes, Molly, I think so. But you cannot help what these bad men do, I know that, and do not blame you. My husband very sorry about fox skins. He cannot find, he no blame. And she seemed to fear that I would attach some blame to the captain. No, indeed, Molly, I don't think your husband can help what they do. I should not have left my fox skins hanging in that room, and will be careful in future. But if they come into my room, they may steal other things, and I do not like it. I know, I know. Sim, no good. Joe, no good. Bub, no good. And she went away in a very depressed state of mind to Jenny and Apuk's baby. Of course, Molly told all to the captain, who immediately accused the men in the bar room, and they all swore vengeance upon me from that on, so I suppose they will do all they can to torment me. We are having a sensation in Chinik. The bloomin' commissioner is about to be deposed from office for unfitness, neglect of duty, and dissipation, and a petition is being handed around the camp by the marshal, praying the Nome authorities that he be retained. The honest storekeeper refused to sign it, as have many of the Swedes. The commissioner swears by all that is good and great to quit drinking and be decent. Time will tell, but I have no faith in him. Molly goes off in these days to look for foxes and to shoot ptarmigan, taking with her a dog team and a native boy or two with their guns. When it is bright and sunny, I take the two little children out in the fur robes on the sled, with a native to push the ladder, and I enjoy the outing fully as well as they. Jenny is put to bed again on her return, and the weight, a sandbag, attached to her foot according to the doctor's orders. The weather is very spring-like, and we have wind imalatuk, as little Charlie says when he has plenty of anything. Snowstorms are sandwiched nicely in between, but many mushers are on the trails. Molly gets now and then a fox, either white or crossed, and one day she brought in a black one. Liquor is doing its fiendish work in camp each hour of the 24. Some are going rapidly down the broad road to destruction. A few turn their backs upon it and seek the straighter way. Some half dozen of the men headed by Sim and Bub are drinking heavily most of the time, gambling between spells for the money with which to buy the poison. Very late one night, a party of drunken men pounded with their fist upon my door. "She's in there, boys," said one of the men in a halting way customary with tipplers. "Bust in the door," blurted another. "Drive her out in here, Bub, you fool," yawned another, almost too sleepy for utterance. In the meantime, I lay perfectly still. Not a sound escaped me, for although my heart beat like a sledgehammer and I was trembling all over, I knew it was best not to speak. After a little more parleying, they all went off to finish their spree elsewhere. Next day I reported the affair to the captain, who, with his wife, in their ground floor apartments in the farther end of the building, had not heard the noise of the night before. Of course the men were now furious, denying everything, calling me a liar ad infinitum. A fine-looking young man, a dentist and doctor, claiming to come from an eastern city, while sitting at the table last evening, after much insane gibberish, fell back intoxicated upon the floor, and lay insensible for some time. He was finally, when the others had finished eating, dragged off to bed in a most inglorious condition, to suffer later for his dissipation. Oh, how my heart ached for his dear old mother so far away. If she had seen him as I saw him, I think she would have died. It is better for her to believe him dead than to know the truth. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24, In a Woman Who Went to Alaska, by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 24, An Unpleasant Adventure. When Sunday comes, Jenny and I always wear our best clothes, neither sewing, studying, nor doing any work. But we read Bible stories, learn verses, look at pictures, and keep the big music box going a good share of the time. Sometimes, if it is bright and warm, I take the two children out for a ride, and Jenny likes to call upon her grandmother. The long front porch of the hotel has been opened again, the sides having been taken off, and the ice and snow cut away from the steps, so the little ones often play upon the porch in the sun for an hour or two. There are now a number of little puppies to be fed and brought up, some of them of pure Eskimo breed, and Charlie likes to frolic with them by the hour. They are very cunning, especially when Molly puts a little harness, which she has made, upon each one, making them pull the sticks of wood she fastens behind in order to teach them to haul a load. Molly is frequently gone for 2 days hunting, and if she does not find what she looks for the first day, she sleeps upon her sled a few hours rolled in her furs, then rises and mushes on again. Far and near, she is known and respected, and the name of Molly in this country is the synonym of all that is brave, true, and womanly, hunting and trapping being for an Eskimo woman some of the most legitimate of pursuits. The name of Angashiak, which means a leader of women in her native tongue, was given her by her parents, as those who know her acknowledge. In severe contrast to the character of Molly is Polly, who has developed an insane jealousy of me on the children's account, and who never loses an opportunity to annoy and insult me, much to my surprise. One day she will hide my books, pour soup over my dress in the kitchen, slam the door in my face, and make jeering remarks in Eskimo, causing the native boys to giggle. And worst of all, telling Charlie in her language that I will kill and eat him, thus making him scream when I attempt to wash or dress him. However, there is another and principal reason for her ill treatment of me, which is far-reaching, for Polly and Sim are cronies, and the girl does what he tells her to do, and that is to torment me as much as possible. For these reasons and others, I decided some time ago to carry my meals into the living room on a tray when I give the children theirs, especially when Molly is away, and the rough element does not feel the restraint of her presence at table. There are no other white women in the house, unless perhaps one comes in from the trail with the men for a day, and these are, as a rule, not the kind of women to inspire the respect of anyone. So I spread Charlie's and my food upon a small table, and Jenny's on her own tray, for after each little outing, she is strapped and weighted down in bed as before. And we would be very happy if it were not for Polly, Sim, and a few other toughs in the hotel and vicinity. Each day I manage, when Jenny is busy with Apuk's baby, O Duck Doc, the deaf girl, grandmother, and her other numerous Eskimo friends, to slip away and run out for a little fresh air, and into the mission for a few minutes. Then I sit down at the organ for a while, or hear of those coming and going on the trails, perhaps climbing the hill behind the mission for more exercise, before going back to Jenny. The first week in April has been pleasant and sunny for the most of the time, but last night, the 8th of the month, the thermometer, with a high wind, fell to 30 degrees below zero, and froze ice 2 inches thick in my room upstairs. Mr. L. and B. have returned from their Koyuk trip, having staked one creek upon which they found colors, and which they were informed by natives was a gold-bearing creek. Their supply of grub would not allow them to remain longer. They have staked a claim for me with the others. Number 14 above Discovery is mine, but they do not give out the name of the creek until they have been up there and staked another stream near the first one. When I get my papers recorded, I shall feel quite proud of this, my best claim, perhaps, so far, and I am thankful and quite happy, except for the disagreeable features of hotel life, which I am always hoping will be soon changed. So long, however, as the deadly liquor is sold in almost every store and cabin, the cause of disturbances will remain, and men's active brains, continually fired with poison as they are, will concoct schemes diabolical enough to shame a Mephistopheles. Today, after due deliberation regarding the matter, I asked B, on the aside, if he would lend me a revolver. He gave me a quick and searching look. "Do you want it loaded?" he asked. "Yes, please, and I will call after supper for it," said I in a low tone while going out the door. Early this morning, putting on my furs and carrying a small shoe box under my arm, I ran over to the Mission. In the hall I was met by B, to whom I handed the box. He took it quietly and went directly to his room, reappearing in a moment and handing it back to me, saying significantly as he did so, "3 doses of that are better than 1, if any are needed," which remark I understood without further explanation. I have brought the box to my room and have placed it under the head of my cot upon the floor, where, in case of emergency, it may be of service. It is not a pretty plaything, and will not be used as such by me, but I shall feel safer to know it is near at hand. Little did I know when I selected my room the day Molly brought me upstairs, that on the other side of the board partition slept the man who had killed another in the early winter, and though the murderer has so far never molested me in any way, still he sometimes gets what they call crazy drunk, and is as liable to kill some other as he was to kill the first. Then, too, thin board walls have ears, and I have heard the mutterings and threats of these wretches for a number of weeks. I have been exceedingly sorry for a month past to see the preparations my friends, the Swedish women in the Mission, are making to go to Nome, and now they expect to start tomorrow. They must be in town to put everything in readiness for the opening of the Star when the first steamers arrive from the outside. The weather is bright and pretty cold today, making the trails good, but in a thaw they are bad and are now liable to break up at any time. Quite a party will go to Nome, Mr. L., M., and others, and they will travel with dogs. I dread to see my Swedish friends, the only white women in this camp with whom I can be friendly, leave Chinik, for I shall then be more alone than ever. If this tiresome ice in the bay would only move out so the boats could get in, we should have others, but there's no telling when that will be. Many are now betting on the breaking up of the ice, and all hope it will be very soon. May 2nd. My Swedish friends left very early today for Nome, and only Miss L. from the Home is there, sweeping out the place, but B. and the visiting preacher will go with her to the Home today, closing the hospitable doors of the Mission for a time. This evening they held a meeting for the natives in camp, and I attended, but it seemed like a funeral without the friends now mushing on the Nome Trail. A woman has come to live at Mellie's and is a study in beaver coat, dyed brown hair, which should be gray according to her age, and with, it is reported, a bank account of $150,000 after having lived in Alaska nearly 5 years. She is called a good stampeder, has a pleasant smiling face, but is usually designated notorious. May 10th. Molly went out early with Mookie, her dog team and guns, to escort Ageetuk, Alice, and Puni Chara, with their mother, who is Molly's aunt, to their new hunting camp in the mountains. At 7 in the evening, Molly returned with wet feet. Tomorrow she will take a net and some other things they have forgotten. They have gone to take their annual spring vacation and hunt gray squirrels for a month, living in a hut in the meantime. The weather is warm and spring-like. May 13th. The captain has been obliged to go to Nome on business, weak and ill though he is, and has been for months. It did not seem to me that he could live through the winter, and he is far too weak to take this long trip over the trail, but he says he is obliged to go and will return at the earliest possible moment. He has taken Fred, the Russian boy, and a team of 9 dogs, leaving after supper and intending to travel night and day, as we now have no darkness. The dissipated men around camp, idle and drunken most of the time, with nothing to occupy their attention after the long, tedious winter, still spend their hours in gossiping, swearing, drinking, and gambling, knowing no day and no night, but making both hideous to those around them. As a destroyer of man's self-respect, independence, and dignity, there is nothing to compare with the accursed liquor. There are numbers of instances in camp proving the truth of this statement. There is the English clergyman's tall and handsome son, well educated, musical, and of agreeable manners, fitted to grace the best society. But liquor is to blame for his present condition, which is about as low as man can sink. It is 10 in the evening, and I am in my little room upstairs, the only white woman in the camp except Mellie and 2 like her. Downstairs in the bar room the men are singing, first coon songs and then church hymns, with all the drunken energy they can muster. The crash of broken glass, angry oaths, and the slamming of doors reaches my ears so frequently as to cause little surprise. The French cooks in the kitchen adding their share to the disturbance. In a distant part of the hotel lies the little sick girl, her cot rolled each night close to the bedside of her mother, who tries to soothe her in her pain. Mollie and the wicked little Eskimo servant being the only women besides myself in the house. The noise and confusion increases downstairs, and I shall sleep little tonight. I will look at my revolver and see that its contents have not been removed. May 15th. Here I am alone with the little children, a bad native girl, and a gang of the worst men in Alaska, Mollie having gone out hunting. At midnight, Sim, Mellie, and several others left for a dance at White Mountain, but it was 2 o'clock in the morning before the house was quiet. While I lay perfectly still and trying to sleep, a man's stealthy footstep passed my door. He walked in his stocking feet. Bare floors and walls echo the slightest sound, and my ears are keen. Was it a friend or foe? What was his object? My heart beat with a heavy thud, but I remembered the loaded revolver under my bed and thanked God for it. After a long time I slept a fitful, uneasy sleep for an hour, and dressed myself as usual at 6:30 o'clock, feeling badly for want of needed sleep. Afterwards I washed, dressed, and fed the children, amusing and entertaining them in my accustomed way. Aggie-Tuck's house being closed, little Charlie is kept here all the time, Polly looking after him nights. A saloon keeper named Fitz, villainous in reality as well as in looks, is hanging around continually, wearing the blackest of looks at everyone, having been in trouble nearly all winter, and closing out his saloon a few weeks ago. A big Dutchman, burly as a blacksmith and well soaked in whiskey, lounges about in blue denim and skull cap, winking his bleared eyes at Polly, and swearing soundly at his native wife when she steps inside the doors to look after him. All went well for a while today after Mollie's leaving, Jenny coaxing to be carried to her grandmother's for a visit, to which I consented, until Charlie and I sat down to supper, which I had spread, as is my habit, in the living room. During the day, I had turned matters well over in mind, and decided, with Molly's advice, to sleep in her bed alongside of Jenny's cot, and to have grandmother stay with us, locking the doors of the rooms as they should be. To my consternation, when I chanced to look for the keys in the doors, there were none, showing plainly that they had been removed. This looked like a trap. There was nothing to do, much as I disliked it, but to ask for the keys, as I would never spend the night in the house without them. Soon afterward the steward entered, and I very calmly and politely asked for the door keys of the 2 rooms, saying that I would spend the night with Jenny. With cool insolence he replied that he would lock them himself. Again the trap. I made no reply. I saw that he had been drinking, that he was not himself, and that it was useless to argue with him. After waiting for an answer and getting none, the man went out carelessly, leaving the door ajar behind him. At that moment, the supper bell rang, and he, with others, sat down to the table. "She wants the keys to the door, she says," drawled the man I had spoken with regarding them. "What'd you tell her?" demanded one of the ruffians. "I told her I would lock the doors myself," said the fellow. "What does she want of the keys? Who is she afraid of? It must be you, bub. 'Tain't me," said one. "You're a liar," shouted Bub. "It's the genial dispenser of booze here beside me she's afraid of." "I'll see to her after supper, you bet," shouted an official voice, at which I shuddered. A general hubbub now ensued. Among others, I could distinguish the word "black snake whip," but I had heard enough. I was planning as I listened. Leaning forward, I kissed the little child beside me and said softly, "Eat all your supper, dear, and then go to Polly. Sully is going to Grandma's." Throwing a light wrap over my head, I ran out of the front door and around the west end of the house, careful not to pass the dining room windows, where the men would see me, and hastened to grandmother's cabin, knowing that I should there find Jenny. Grandmother lived alone, except for Odukdak, the deaf girl, and they must give me shelter for the night. Here I found Jenny quite happy, with her deaf friend sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, while her grandmother was busy with her work. In a few words I explained to the old woman the situation, and I was made welcome, Jenny being pleased to remain in the cabin all night. I knew Polly would put Charlie to bed when the time came, and the boy was safe enough where he was. I did not believe the gang would disturb me in grandmother's cabin, but I feared they would loot my room in my absence. Here Jenny could assist me. I now asked her to have Odukdak go out for the native named Koki and bring him to me, which she did, the deaf girl understanding by the motion of the child's lips what was being said. Odukdak then drew on her parkie and went out. "Koki," said I, when the native had entered the room a few minutes later and closed the door behind him, "will you go to my room, number 3 in the hotel, and get some things for me?" "Yes," was the laconic reply of the man. "Here is the key of the door. Between the mattresses of the bed you will find 2 books, and in the shoebox on the floor there is a revolver. Bring them to me under your parkie so no one shall see what you have. Take this little key, lock my trunk, and be sure you fasten the door behind you. You won't forget?" "All right, I no forget," and Koki grinned and went out. He did not forget. In about 20 minutes he returned, bringing the keys, revolver, and diaries which I had kept hidden for fear the lawless fellows might find and destroy them. I now felt much relieved. I did not think the gang would come to the cabin, but in case they did, there was the revolver, and grandmother's 2 doors had locks, which, if not the very strongest, were better than none. and I fastened them immediately after Koki's departure. May 18th. The night I slept in grandmother's cabin with Jenny passed quietly for us. I slept in my clothes and mucklucks, an old quilt and fur parkie on some boards being my bed, though grandmother finally gave me a double blanket for covering when I asked for it. It was long past midnight before we slept. The child was restless and urged her grandmother to tell her Eskimo stories. Duck slept heavily, unconscious of all around her. My own senses were on the alert. I listened intently to catch every sound, but we were too far away from the hotel to hear the carousal that I well knew was there in progress. The mushers from the dance were hourly expected home, and would then add their part to the midnight orgies. The low droning of the old Eskimo woman, telling her tales of the Inuits, of the polar bear, the seal and the walrus, of the birds, their habits and nestlings. This was the only sound I heard. After a time, the others slept, and I went to the window and looked out. At my right, only a stone's throw away, was the mission, its windows and doors all fastened, and its occupants gone. I felt a heart-sinking sensation as I thought of the friends who were there lately. Across the way was the old schoolhouse, in which were the musician, his partner, and the deaf man, who had been bitten by the mad dog. They were within calling distance, and for that I felt thankful. I had dreaded the night in the cabin for fear that I should suffer for fresh air, but seeing a broken pane of glass into which some cloth had been stuffed, I removed the latter and allowed the pure air to enter. Of course, the place was scented with seal oil, but grandmother's cabin was comparatively tidy and clean. Next morning, when we knew that breakfast was over, we went in a body to the hotel, grandmother carrying Jenny on her back, according to Eskimo custom. Some of the men were still sleeping off their dissipation of the night before. Nothing was said about our remaining away, and the Eskimo women spent the day with us. Others also came, called quietly in to see Jenny, and remained to the meals I was glad to give them for their company. When 6 o'clock arrived, and still we saw nothing of Molly, I felt anxious. If she did not return, it meant another night in the native hut for us. 8, 9, 10 o'clock. Thank God! She had come at last. I could have hugged her for joy. She had nearly 100 ptarmigan, enough to last till the captain came home, and would not leave us again alone. Later. The captain returned from Nome, having made the trip of 85 miles and back by dog team in 4 days and nights, a very quick trip indeed. The toughs have subsided, and are on their good behavior for the present, at least, fearing what the captain will say and do when their last doings are reported, but I understand that most of them are mortally offended at my remaining at grandmother's, as no one takes offense so easily as a rogue when his honesty is doubted. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 25. Stones and Dynamite. The last week of May has finally come, and with it, real spring weather. The children play out in the sand heap on the south side of the house for hours together, enjoying the warm sunshine and pleasant air, the little girl clothed from head to foot in furs. Never has a springtime been so welcome to me, perhaps because in striking contrast to the long, cold winter through which we have just passed. From the hillside behind the mission, the snow is slowly disappearing. First from the most exposed spots and rocks, the gullies keeping their drifts and ice longer. Mosses are everywhere, peeping cheerfully up at me in all their tints of gorgeous green, some that I found recently being tipped with the daintiest of little red cups. This, with other treasures, I brought in my basket to Jenny when I returned from my daily walk upon the hill, and together we studied them closely under the magnifying glass. To examine the treasures brought in by Molly, however, we needed no glass. They are sandpipers, ptarmigan, squirrels, and occasionally a wild goose, shot, perhaps, in the act of flying over the hunter's head, as these birds are now often seen and heard going north. In the evening I see from my window the neighboring Eskimo children playing with their sleds, and sometimes they light a bonfire, shouting and chattering in their own unique way. All mushers now travel at night when the trail is frozen, as it is too soft in the daytime, and the glare from the sun often causes snow blindness. Then, too, there is water on the ice in places, which we are glad to see, and pools of the same are standing around the mission and schoolhouse. I can no longer go out in my mucklucks, but must wear my long rubber boots and short skirts. Today I went out for an hour, walking to Chinook Creek over the tundra, from which the snow has almost disappeared, and returned by the hilltop path. The tundra was beautiful with mosses. Birds were singing, and the rushing and roaring of the creek waters fairly made my head swim. There were such unusual sounds. The water was cutting a channel in the sands where it empties into the bay. Here it was flowing over the ice, helping to loosen the edge and allow it to drift out to sea. There is little change in the manners and dispositions of the rough men in camp. There are the same things with which to contend day after day, the same annoyances and trials to endure, with new ones in addition quite frequently. June has come at last, and all the world should be happy. But alas, there is always some worm in the bud to do the blasting. This morning, about 3 o'clock, I was wakened by the sound of drunken voices outside my window, followed by stones hurled against the side of the house. Quickly rising, I cautiously peeped out from behind the curtain, but was not surprised at what I saw. There, about 100 feet away, were 4 men, all well known to me as members of the gang, and all in the most advanced stages of intoxication. On the step of a neighboring cabin sat the murderer, Ford, hugging in a maudlin way a big black bottle. On the ground, in the dirt, there rolled 2 young men, the Englishman underneath, and Big Bub over him. Sim, the leader, had aimed 4 stones at my window, but missed it, and felt the need of more stimulant, so he took the bottle from Ford, carried it to the lumber pile a few feet away, sat down, put it to his lips, and drank heavily. Again and again he tipped up the bottle while he drank, but finally threw it away empty. Then, with much exertion, he stooped to pick up a stone. He was aiming at my window. I dodged into a corner, but the box washstand stood partly in my way. Would he hit his mark? I did not believe it. He was too drunk. Crack! Came the stone against the house. I waited. Another followed. In the meantime, the other men had paid no attention to him as Ford was watching the 2 tumblers, the lumber pile being between them and Sim, and the 3 started for the front door around the south side of the house. Sim followed them. I now hoped he would forget his stone throwing. When they were all out of sight, I breathed more freely. Surely now the trouble was over, I thought, and I threw off my fur coat which I had hastily pulled on over my wrapper, crept into bed, and covered my head with the blankets. I now thought quickly. Even if Sim should forget to throw more stones, would he not soon come upstairs and perhaps give me more trouble? Would it not be better to dress myself and be prepared for any emergency? I was hurriedly deliberating upon the matter, my head still covered with the blankets, when there was a loud crash and shivered glass covered the floor and the bedclothes. Instantly throwing the ladder back, I looked around me. I could see no stone, and I had heard none fall upon the floor, but it must be there somewhere. I now stepped carefully out of bed, in order to avoid the glass, my feet already in knit wool slippers with thick warm soles, and again looked out. There was no one to be seen. Sim had done his dastardly work and gone indoors. Would this end it? My teeth shattered, and I felt cold. I must keep my nerve, however, and I did so, dressing myself carefully, even to my stout shoes, which I laced up in front and tied. Then I drew on my fur coat and sat down to wait. Below, the four men were poking around in the kitchen, trying to find something to eat or drink. It was not long before I heard them coming upstairs, and all tumbled into the next room, which was occupied by Ford. If they came to molest me further, there was yet one way of escape, which I would try before using my revolver, the weapon I did not want to use unless driven to it. There was the staging outside my window, which had never been removed since the house was built the year before. I could very easily step out upon it and walk to the end of the house, but then I must either jump or remain, for there was no ladder. This staging was perhaps 20 feet from the ground, and the ladder frozen. To slide down a post would tear my hands fearfully. I had not long to wait. To go peaceably to bed seemed to be the last thing these men thought of, and one picked up a gun, which, for hunting purposes, every man in the house kept close at hand. "I say now, bub, put up that gun. This ain't no place for shootin'," drawled a thick, sleepy voice which I recognized instantly. "Shut your gab! Who's hurting you?" answered Bub, the biggest of the four, and one of the ugliest when intoxicated. "Mrs. Sullivan's in the next room. You wouldn't shoot her, would you?" asked Sim sneeringly in a loud tone, for he could stand up under great quantities of liquor. "Shh! Keep still a minute, you fool!" in a harsh whisper from Bub. I was now thankful that I was dressed. I waited no longer. Opening the door, I ran downstairs to Mollie and the captain, knocking loudly upon their door. "Hang those brutes!" exclaimed the captain angrily, when I had finished telling him what had happened. "What is the matter with them, anyway?" "Whiskey," said I. "They are all as drunk as pirates." "Show me your room and window," demanded the captain, who by this time had gotten into some of his clothing and stepped into the living room where I was. I then led the way upstairs and threw open my door. What a sight! Broken glass covered the floor and bed, the cool morning air pouring in through the broken pane of which there was little left in the sash. That was enough for the captain. He made straight for the next room, where all was now perfectly still, only Ford remaining in it, the others having had sense enough to sneak off to their own places after hearing me run downstairs to report. Seizing my blankets, I closed and locked the door and made my way downstairs to Mollie. Above, we could hear the captain's voice in angry altercation with the men, they denying everything, of course, even the stone throwing, with the window as evidence against them. It was 4:30, and I had slept little. There was no fire in the house, and I was cold, so throwing down a few skins in a corner of the sewing room, with my blankets upon them, I covered myself to get warm. At last, the house was once more quiet, and I slept for an hour, only to meet black and angry looks from the men all day, accompanied by threats and curses, though I said nothing to them. I picked up the stone from my reindeer rug where it had fallen after shattering the window pane, and it lay only 2 feet from my head. It was about the size of an egg. Of course, it is impossible for me to leave Chinik, as the winter trails are broken up, the ice has not left the bay, and no steamers can enter, so we are practically prisoners. Oh, how I long to get away from this terrible place. Never since I came to Chinik have I given these men one cross word, and yet they hate me with a bitter, jealous hatred, such as I have never before seen. Some weeks ago I pinned a slip of paper into my Bible, upon which I have written the address of my parents, in case anything should happen to me. Oh, to be once more safe at home with them. God grant that I may be before many months shall have passed. A splendid, warm, bright day, June 13th, the most of which the children and I have spent upon the sandy beach in front of the hotel. Little Jenny lies and plays on the warm, dry sand, though, of course, she does not stand on her feet nor walk. Other small Eskimos come to play with them, for Charlie is always on hand for a play spell on the sand, and I doze and read under my umbrella in the meantime, with an eye always upon them. They make sand pies, native igloos, and many imaginary things and places, but more than any other thing is my mind upon the coming of the steamers, when I hope to get away. Molly came in last night from a seal hunt upon the ice, and she, with the 3 native boys, secured a white seal and 8 others, but did not bring all with them. There is a great deal of water on the ice at this time, and none but natives like to travel upon it. Ducks and geese are flying northward in flocks above our heads, and we feast daily upon them. They are very large and tasty, and the cook knows well how to serve them. We now see a line of blue water out beyond the ice, and even distinguish white breakers in the distance. Today I took a field glass, and climbing the hill behind the mission to look as far out as possible, strained my eyes to see a steamer. As I stood upon the point to get a better view, the whole world around seemed waking from a long, long sleep. At my left was Chinik Creek, pouring its rushing waters out over the bay ice with a cheerful, rapid roaring. Farther away south stretched the Darby Cape into blue water, which looked like indigo, surmounted by long rolling breakers with combs of white, all being fully 14 miles away. To the northwest of the sandspit upon which Chinik is built, and which cuts Golovin Bay almost in two, the Fish River is also emptying itself, as is Kitchawik Creek and other smaller streams. Overall, the welcome sunshine is flooded, warming the buds and roots on the hillside, and making all beautiful. June 17th. This is Bunker Hill Day in New England, and the men have been celebrating on their own account, setting off a 50-pound box of dynamite in the neighborhood to frighten the women, I suppose. The shock was terrific, breaking windows, lampshades, and jarring bottles and other articles off the shelves. Jenny was dreadfully frightened, and screamed for a few minutes while the living room soon filled with men inquiring the cause of the explosion. By and by a man came in saying that another box of giant powder would be set off, but with that the marshal left the room with a determined face, and we heard no more dynamiting. The men, as usual, were intoxicated. I have just had a pleasant little outing at the home, going with Molly, who invited me to go with her. She was going out seal hunting on the ice, would leave me at the home for a short visit, and pick me up on her return. Ageetuk and grandmother would take good care of Jenny for so short a time, and I needed the change, so I ran up to my room, threw some things hastily into a small bag to take with me, locked my trunk. I had long ago put a package consisting of papers and diaries into the safe and the kind storekeeper's care, dressed myself in my shortest skirts and longest rubber boots, and we started. The weather was too warm for furs and sunshine, or while running behind a sled, so I wore a thick jacket, black straw hat with thick veil, and kid gloves. We left the hotel about 7:30 in the evening, but with the sun still high and warm. Molly had her small sled and 3 dogs, with Mookie and Puni Chara and their guns. The other sled was a large one, and to it were hitched 7 good dogs, accompanied by Ituk and Koki. Upon the sleds were furs, guns, bags, and fishing tackle. Along shore there was considerable water on the ice. In a few spots the latter had disappeared, and we could see the sandy beach. But farther east the ice was firmer, and Molly, who made for the best looking places, led the way, I running closely in her footsteps. Behind us came the men in teams, the calls of the Eskimos to their dogs sounding musically on the quiet evening air. Molly and I were now leaping over water-filled cracks or lanes in the ice, she having assured me that after getting away from the shore it would be better traveling, and we could ride on the sleds when we were tired. But I felt considerable pride in keeping up with her, and soon grew very warm from the stiff exercise, unaccustomed as I was, while she was well used to it. After we had left the shore some distance behind us, we halted for the sleds to come up, Molly seating herself upon the small one, I waiting for the other a little later. There I ran at the handlebars for a time, but at last I threw myself upon the sled among the furs and pulled a parkie over me. We were now in the water a foot deep most of the time, the dogs picking their way along over the narrowest water lanes, Ituk and Koki shouting to them to gee and haw, and with Eskimo calls and whip snapping, urging them on continually. Soon we left the smaller sled behind, Molly, Mookie, and Puni making the air ring with laughter and Eskimo songs. As we started out from home, the sun shone brightly upon us, but as we left the land at our backs and made our way farther out upon the bay, the sun dropped lower and lower, the sky became a mass of crimson and yellow, and the whole world seemed modestly blushing. Along the east shore the rolling hills lay almost bare of snow, the brown tundra appearing softly and most artistically colored. To the north the mountains were still tipped with snow, as was also the promontory, Cape Darby, at the extreme southeast point. This was spotted and streaked with white, its rocky cliff black in shadow by contrast. Our eyes eagerly scanned the horizon for steamers, and a schooner had been reported off Darby loaded with fresh fruits and vegetables, but we could not see it. By and by we were past most of the water lanes, and the ice was better. At 9:30 in the evening, the sky was exceedingly grand, and a song of gratitude welled up in my heart, for this was another world from the one we had just left, and I no longer wondered at Molly's love of hunting in the fresh air, under the beautiful skies, and with her freedom to travel wherever she liked. With her I felt perfectly safe. No harm could come to me when Molly led the way, and my confidence in the native men was equally strong. For were they not as familiar with ice and water as with land? I soon saw that we were headed toward the island, though I did not know why, and by this time Molly was far ahead. Also that we were being followed by a dog team from Chinik, which puzzled me, for I had not heard that others were going out hunting for seal, or starting for the home which was my destination. When we reached the north end of the small island, Molly ran up the path like a deer, I following, as did the natives, leaving the dogs to rest upon the ice. From a hole in the rocks, Koki now hauled his kayak, or small skin boat, where he had left it from a former trip, and dragging it down upon the ice, he lashed it upon the small sled to be carried still farther. The dog team, which I had seen following in the distance, had now come up with us, and I heard one man say to the other, "There's Mrs. Sullivan," but I did not recognize the voice. When they came nearer, we found it to be two men from camp who were going out to the schooners to buy fruit and vegetables, and they wanted to get a dog belonging to them which Molly had borrowed and had hitched into her team. A change of dogs was then made, and we started, Molly and I on her big sled, the other two following. We now skirted the rocky cliffs and found the ice hummocky between great, deep cracks where the water was no longer white, but dark and forbidding. Sometimes Koki suddenly started the dogs to one side to avoid dark-looking holes in the ice, the dogs leaping over seams which quickly lay beneath us as the fore and hinder parts of our sled bridged the crevasse of ugly water. Now the sled swayed from side to side as the dogs made sudden curves or dashes. Then a big hummock of ice and snow had to be crossed, and one end of the sled went up while the other went down. I was holding onto the side rails with both hands, and knowing that the sled was a good strong one, I had no fear of its breaking, but my feet were cold in my rubber boots, and I had drawn some furs over me. Molly is not a great talker. She seldom explains anything, and one only has to wait and see the outcome of her movements. And this I did, when she suddenly, with Ituk, left the sleds and climbed the rocks of the island again on the south side. Then I saw them gathering sticks and small driftwood, and knew that they would make a fire upon the ice at midnight, while preparing to hunt for seals. Coming to a rough place, with high-piled ice between great ugly seams, over which the sagacious dogs dragged the sleds always in a straight line, not slantwise, I climbed out, and Molly and Ituk came with their driftwood, which they threw upon the sled. The two men making for the schooner, forging ahead in the direction of Cape Darby. Ituk and Muky now made ready to go with me to the home, a half-mile away to the east, where they were also to get some bread, this important item having been forgotten in the hurry of departure from Chinik. In the meantime, Molly, not to lose a moment of time, as is her method, had gotten out her fishing tackle and was already fishing for tomcod through a hole in the ice. Bidding her beoqua, goodbye, we started for the home, Ituk politely taking my little bag, and Muky leaping lightly over the rocks toward the mainland. Along the shore of the island, I was fearful of cutting my boots on the jagged rocks and rubble thickly strewn over the sands, and had to proceed cautiously for a time. But Ituk, perceiving my difficulty, led to a smoother path, and we were soon on the mainland, and upon the soft tundra, when it was only a few minutes' walk to the home. It was 11 o'clock in the evening, and we found the missionaries just returned from a trip to the schooner, where they had secured fresh potatoes and onions. The smell and taste of an onion was never so good to me before, and the potatoes were the first we had seen in 6 months. I had been in the home in the early spring for a day, and now, as then, met with a warm welcome from the missionaries. They now had double the number of native children they had in Chinik, and their house is large and commodious, though unfinished. I was assigned the velvet couch upon which I had spent a good many nights, and the two natives returned to Molly after securing some bread from Miss E. for their lunches. Next day we visited, and I rested considerably, finding again how good it was to be in a safe and quiet place, with no fear of stone throwers or giant powder. About 10:30 o'clock in the evening, just after the sun had set, we started on our return trip, Molly having arrived with her dog teams and natives. The sunset sky was exceedingly beautiful, but beneath our feet we had only very bad ice and water. Near the island, great ice cakes were floating, interspersed with dark seams and lanes wider than we had before seen. Sometimes I rode on one of the sleds, or walked, ran, or leaped over the water holes to keep up with the rest until too tired and heated, when I threw myself upon a sled again. But as we proceeded, we found firmer ice and less water. Molly and I had both to ride upon one sled now, for Ituk had lashed the kayak upon the little one, and they were one dog short, as an animal had run away while they were eating supper at the home. Finally, pitying the dogs upon the large sled, who seemed to have a heavy load, although only one seal, as they had met with little success in hunting, I motioned to Ituk to wait for me, which he did. "Ituk," I called as I came nearer, "let me ride in the kayak, will you?" "You ride in kayak?" asked the man in surprise. "Yes, let me get in. I will hold on tight." And as he made no objection, I climbed upon the boat, crept into the hole made for that purpose, and sat down. "All right, Ituk, I am ready," I said. The man laughed, cracked his whip, and the dog started. I had not before realized that I would be sitting so high up, and that at each dip in a crack or depression of the ice, when the sled runner ran a little higher than the other, I should stand a grand chance of being spilled into the water. But my feet were so cold in my rubber boots that I was thinking to get them under cover would be agreeable, and though Ituk probably well knew what the outcome of my ride would be, he very patiently agreed to allow me to try it. We had not gone far when our dogs made a sudden dash or turn, the right-hand runner slipped lengthwise into a seam, and over we went, sled, kayak, woman, and all upon the ice in a sorry heap. The dogs halted instantly, and Ituk, who had been running on the left-hand side of them, came back at my call. "Oh, Ituk, come here and help me. I cannot get out of the kayak," I cried lustily. "I will not get into it again," and I rubbed my wrist upon which the skin had been slightly bruised, and he assisted me to my feet. The native laughed. "Kayak no good. Riding heap better run," he said. "That's so, Ituk, but my feet are very cold." "Get warm quick. You running," was his reply, and we started on again. When 5 or 6 miles from Chinik, the water became more troublesome, and our progress was slow. We were wading through holes, leaping over seams, and treading through slush and water. It was colder than the night before. A thin skin of ice was forming, but not firm enough to hold one up. I was cold and cuddled into the sled with Molly, but the two natives running alongside were continually sitting upon the rail to get a short ride instead of walking, thus loading the sled too heavily upon one side, and we were soon all tumbled into water a foot deep. As I went over, I threw out my arm to save myself, and my sleeve was soaked through in an instant. Koki and Muki thought it great fun, and laughed and shouted in glee, but to me it was a little too serious. My clothes were wet through on my right side, and I was now obliged to run whether I wanted to do so or not, for we were fully a mile from home. My gloves and handkerchief were soaked with water, and I threw them away, thrusting my hands into my jacket pockets and running to keep up with the others. We were now wading and leaping across frequent lanes, and were more in the water than upon the ice. The sharp eyes of the natives had discerned the shoreline well bordered by open water, and they were wondering how they would get across. Finally, we could get no farther, and were 100 feet from the beach. "Dogs can swim," said Molly sententiously, as was her habit. "How will you and I get on shore, Molly?" I asked anxiously. "Ituk, big man. He carry you, maybe," answered Molly roguishly with a twinkle. "But I continued seriously. How deep is the water anyway, Koki? Seeing that he had been wading in to find out. Not much deep. We walk all right. 'Bout up here." And the native placed his hand halfway between his knee and thigh to show the depth. Then walking a little farther down towards the hotel, he seemed to find a better place and called for all to follow, which we did. The men waded across to the shore, stepping upon stones which now and then, at this point, were embedded in the sand, Molly boldly following their example. All wore high-skin boots, coming far above their knees and watertight. But my rubber boots had never been put to a test like this, only coming a little above my knees where the soft tops were confined by a drawstring, and this water was very cold, as I had good reason to know. However, there was nothing to do but go on, first watching the others, and then plunging boldly in. I drew my boot tops higher, fastened the strings securely, picked up my short skirts and wound them closely about me, but not in a manner to impede my progress, and stepped in. By this time the dogs and men were upon the sands, and making for home only a few rods away. But I took my time, walking slowly in order that the water should not slop over the tops of my boots, and we finally reached the beach and the house safely. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 26. Goodbye to Golovin Bay. On the morning of the 26th of June, I awoke to find that the ice had drifted out to sea in the night, 8 days after Molly and I had taken our 12 miles trip across the bay and return. Then came hard rain and wind that for several days blew the ice back into the bay, first to one side and then to the other, so that the steamers waiting to come in could not do so for fear of the drifting floes. By the 30th of June, schooners were coming into the bay with passengers and freight, and the coast steamers, Elmore and Dora, had begun to make regular trips to and from Nome. With them came mails from the outside, with newspapers and tidings of friends in the States. Then our fingers trembled at opening our letters until we found that all our dear ones were well, and we heartily thanked the Lord. There were other white women in camp by this time, and many strangers at the hotel, among others officials and those in authority. Since the stone-throwing episode, the marshal had been doing duty as watchman, sleeping during the day and guarding the house nights, the heavy iron bracelets in his inner coat pocket weighing scarcely more than the loaded revolver in his belt. Our little sick girl, being obliged now to keep her bed continually, with no more playing in the sand and sunshine, although her cough had left her, was still the same sweet, patient child she had been through all her illness, and my whole time was given to her. Before one of the sunny south windows of the living room, we placed her cot each morning, and here she received her numerous friends, both Eskimo and white, and their names were legion. They came from the east, west, north, and south, all sorry to know of her illness and bringing presents with them. Sometimes it was a little live bird or squirrel, a delicious salmon trout, or wild fowl for her supper. Sometimes it was candy, nuts, or fresh fruit from Nome, and with everything she was well pleased and joyous. Friends soon came in from the outside, bringing city dolls dressed in ribbons and laces. There were tiny dishes, chairs, tables, 100 things dear to a little girl's heart, and all pleased her immensely. But all were laid quickly aside for a basket of wild flowers or mosses, for a fish, bird, animal, or baby, showing plainly her taste for the things of nature in preference to art. Her love for her birthplace, with its hills, streams, and ocean, is a sincere one, and young as she is, and having seen the great city by the Golden Gate, with many of its wonders, she is happiest in Chinik. Here lives her dear old grandmother, her cousins and aunts, not to mention the little calico-capped baby belonging to Apuk, for which she has a whole heart full of love, and the sight of which is better to her than medicine. During the month of July, we eagerly watched the incoming steamers, and welcomed all newcomers who landed in Chinik. Many were simply passing through on their way up Fish River to the mines, and praise of the land of the Ophir gold was sung on all sides. A few remained for the summer. Here men built boats, and rowed away to Keechawik and Nukluk, carrying supplies for hunting or prospecting. The captain's vegetable garden in the sand was growing rapidly, and was watched with eager eyes by everyone. We ate lettuce and radishes, picked fresh from the garden beds where they had been sown by the captain's own hands, and we found Ageetuk and Molly to be quite famous cooks. Nothing so delicious as their salads, for the French cooks had long ago gone, the hotel management being changed, and Molly had a nice little kitchen of her own. And with fresh salmon trout, wild fowl, fresh meats and vegetables, we made up for many months of winter dieting. All this time I longed to get away. I was going each day to the hilltop to watch for the steamers which would bring the letters for which I waited. Affairs connected with my gold claims were, with much anxiety and trouble, arranged as well as possible, and when I boarded the steamer, I would carry with me at least 3 deeds to as many claims, with a fair prospect of others. But I could not decide to remain another winter. I was determined to go to St. Michael, up the Yukon to Dawson, and outside, and laid my plans accordingly. Letters from my father and brother in Dawson had been received. How my heart ached when I thought of leaving the little sick girl and Charlie, the latter now grown willful, but still so bright and pretty. I wanted to take both with me, but no, I could not. The little girl's work was not ended. Here is a wonderful mission, and she is surely about to fulfill it. Born as she was in a rough mining camp at the foot of the barren hills, she was given the Eskimo name of Yakuk, meaning a little hill, and she, like an oasis in a desert place, is left here to cheer, love, and help others. Many times I have seen evidence of the sweet and gentle influences going out from the life of little Yakuk as she lies upon her cot of pain. A tall brown miner enters the living room, goes to the little bed by the window, speaks softly, and, bending over the tiny girl, kisses her. Then her big black eyes glance brightly into blue ones looking down from above. Full red lips part in a cordial smile, while the one solitary dimple in the smooth round cheek pricks its way still deeper, and small arms go up around his neck. When the man turns, his face wears a soft and tender expression as though he were looking at some beautiful sight far away, and perhaps he is. God grant that the sweet memory of that little child's kiss may be so lasting that all their lives, he and others, may be purer and better men. When August came, I sailed away. The Dora had entered the bay in the morning and found my trunk packed and waiting. It was then only the work of a little time to make ready to leave. To my good missionary friends I had already said good-bye, and the captain and Molly were kindly regretful. With tears in my eyes, but with real pain in my heart, I bade Jenny good-bye, and stepped into the little boat which was to carry me to the Dora. Farewell, then, to Chinik, the home of the north wind and blizzard, Farewell to the ice fields of Golovin, so tardy in leaving in summer, and to Keechawik and Chinook, whose clear rushing waters so cheered us in springtime. Farewell to the moss-covered hills and paths thickly bordered with blossoms. Farewell to my white-faced friends, and to the dark-skinned ones. Beoqua. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Karen Commins. Chapter 27. Going Outside. Do I sleep? Do I dream? Do I wonder and doubt? Are things what they seem? Or are visions about? I was now actually on my way home. It was not a dream, for here I was on board the snug little ocean steamer Dora, belonging to the Alaska Commercial Company, and I was on my way to St. Michael and Dawson. For ocean travel, our steamer was a perfect one in all its appointments, being staunch and reliable, with accommodating officers. After taking a last look at Chinook, I went to my stateroom. Only one stop was made before we reached St. Michael, that being at Port Bay, a new mining camp where for some hours freight was unloaded. In about 22 hours from the time we left Chinook, we were in St. Michael Harbor, climbing down upon a covered barge which took us ashore. It was nearly 2 years since I had first landed at this dock, then in a snowstorm, now in the rain, then with my brother, now alone. Not at all like Nome is this quiet little hamlet of St. Michael by the sea. Neither saloons nor disorderly places are allowed upon the island. What was formerly a canteen for soldiers was now a small but tidy restaurant, where I ate a good dinner of beefsteak with an appetite allowable in Alaska. Upon the streets and about the barracks were many boys in blue, while the hotel parlors swarmed at dinner time with officers and their wives and daughters, all richly and fashionably attired. At the parlor piano, 2 ladies performed a duet, while the silken skirts of others rustled in an aristocratic manner over the thick carpet, and gentlemen in dress suits and gold-laced uniforms gracefully posed and chatted. For my own part, a little homesick feeling had to be resolutely put down as I pulled on my old raincoat, and with umbrella and handbag, trudged out in the darkness and rain to look for my baggage. I had already secured my transportation at the steamship office, where, at the hands of the kindly manager of the Alaska Commercial Company's affairs in this country, I had received the most courteous treatment I could desire. With little delay, I found my trunk and went on board the Yukon steamer T.C. Power. Some months before, a consolidation of the 3 largest transportation companies in Alaska had been effected, including the Alaska Commercial Company, and I was now traveling with the latter under the name of the Northern Commercial Company, but I felt a security like that of being in charge of an old and trustworthy friend, and was quite content. I had a long journey before me. We should reach Dawson in 14 days, unless we met with delays, but a fast-rising wind warned us that we might encounter something of the sort where we were, and we did. For 2 days and nights our steamer lay under the lee of the island, not daring to venture out in the teeth of the gale which buffeted us. Straining, creaking, swaying, first one way and then the other, we lay waiting for the storm to abate. No river steamer with stern wheel and of shallow draft could safely weather the rough sea for 60 miles to the Yukon's mouth, and we tried to be patient. Early on the morning of the 3rd day, we started, and for 12 hours we plowed our way through the waters with bow now deep in the trough of the sea, now lifted high in midair, to be met the next moment by an uprising roller which, with a boom and a jar, sent a quiver through the whole vessel. When at last the Yukon was reached, another obstacle appeared, and we stuck fast on a sandbar. Soon 2 other steamers lay alongside, waiting, as did we, for a high tide to float us. By night we lay in a dead calm. Indians in canoes came with fish and curios to sell, and we watched the lights of the other steamers. When the high tide came, we floated off the bar, but the scene was one of dull monotony, and it was not until the day following that we came into the hill country, and I was permitted to again see the dear trees I loved so well, not one of which I had seen since leaving California. At Anvik, there came on board a little missionary teacher bound for Philadelphia, who had spent 7 years with the natives in this Episcopal mission without a vacation, and her stories were interesting in the extreme. Our days were uneventful. A broken stern wheel, enforced rest upon sandbars, frequent stops at wood yards with a few moments run upon shore in which to gather autumn leaves and get a sniff of the woods. This was our life upon the Yukon steamer for many days. After a while, the nights grew too dark for safe progress, and the boat was tied up until daylight. Russian Mission, Tanana, Rampart, Fort Yukon, and the Flats were passed, and the days wore tediously on. We were literally worming our way upstream, with low water and dark nights to contend with, but a second summer was upon us with warm, bright sunshine, and the hills were brilliantly colored. One morning we approached the towering Roquette Rock, so named by Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka in his explorations down the Yukon years before, and connected with which is an Indian legend of some interest. This immense rock, so the story runs, once formed a part of the western shore of the Yukon, and was one of a pair of towering cliffs of about the same size, and with similar characteristics. Here the 2 huge cliffs lived for many geological periods in wedded bliss as man and wife, until finally family dissensions invaded the rocky household, and ended by the stony-hearted husband kicking his wrangling wife into the distant plain, and changing the course of the great river so that it flowed between them, to emphasize the perpetual divorce. The cliff and the rock are still known as the Old Man and the Old Woman, the latter standing in isolation upon a low, flat island with the muddy Yukon flowing on both sides. At this time of the year, the days in Alaska grow perceptibly shorter, and we were not surprised to find dusky twilight at 5 in the afternoon, and to notice the eerie loneliness of the dark, sweet-scented woods a few hours later, when the steamer laid tide to the river's bank. One night after dinner, a number of passengers sat idly about in the saloon of our steamer. Many had grown tired of cards, or had lost their money, and, finding themselves pitted against more lucky players, had called a halt and looked for other occupation. Miners lounged about, chatting of the gold mines, their summer's work and experiences. Big Curly and his little black-eyed wife listened attentively for a time. The old miner was a born storyteller, and knew a good yarn when he heard it. The boat was tied up for the night, and all was quiet around us. It was the time and place for a story. At last, Big Curly hitched his chair out farther from the wall, and placed his feet comfortably upon the rungs. Then, shifting his tobacco from one cheek to the other, he asked if anyone present had heard the story of Nelson and the ghost. No one had heard it, and after some coaxing, this is the tale he told. The Ghost of 40 Mile. Alaska has long smiled over old Indian legends, but Yukon men are still puzzling over the nocturnal rambles of the ghost of a murdered man in the 40 Mile district. Following the excitement of the discovery of Bonanza Bar and the sensational riches of Franklin Gulch came the murder of an old Frenchman named La Salle. Tanana Indians committed the crime in 1886. They crossed the mountains to 40 Mile and killed La Salle in his cabin at the mouth of O'Brien Creek. With axes and bludgeons, the old Frenchman's head was crushed beyond recognition. 3 months later, the snow lay thick upon the ground. Upon the branches of trees it persistently hung, each added layer clinging tenaciously because there was no breath of wind to send it to the ground. Occasionally a dead twig, weighted too heavily by the increasing fall of snow, broke suddenly and dropped noiselessly into a bed of feathery flakes, thus joining its sleeping companions, the leaves. It was in January that 2 men might have been seen following their dog teams down a frozen stream emptying into 40 Mile River. They wished to reach the mouth of the creek before they halted for the night. They had heard of a cabin in which they planned to spend the night, although it was a deserted one, and they were almost at the desired point. The men were Swedes. They were strong and hardy fellows, and although frost covered their clothing and hung in icicles about their faces, they ran contentedly behind the dog teams in the semi-darkness, as only the snowlight remained. "Hello!" called out Swanson finally to his companion. "Is that the place, do you think?" pointing to the dim shape of a log cabin a little ahead. "Guess it is, but we'll find out. I'm nearly starved and must stop soon anyway," said Nelson decidedly. "It's no use for us to travel further tonight." "So I think," was the reply, as the dogs halted before the door, and the men entered the cabin. Here they found a good-sized room, containing one window. There was evidently a room on the other side, but with no connecting door, the 2 cabins having been built together to save laying one wall. "This is good enough for me, and much warmer than a tent. We'll stay here till morning and take the dogs inside," said kind-hearted Nelson, already unhitching the dogs from a sled. Swanson did the same. The next moment their small store was carried into the cabin, wood was collected, and a cheery fire soon roared up the chimney. After the men had eaten their supper and the dogs had been fed, pipes were brought out, and stretching themselves upon their fur sleeping bags before the fire, the miners smoked and chatted while resting their weary limbs. Suddenly, in the midnight stillness, they heard a strange noise in the other part of the cabin. Someone was moaning and crying for help. There was no mistaking the sound, and both men were wide awake and intently listening. It was the cry of someone in distress. The sounds grew more blood-curdling. Nelson, unable to restrain himself longer, ran outside to investigate. Going to the window, he looked inside. The sight he beheld congealed his blood and fastened him to the spot as in a trance. This was the image of a man surrounded by a cloud of white, mist-like phosphorescent light, a deep scar standing out like a bleeding gash down the side of the head. Then the forgotten story of the murdered La Salle came to his mind, and for several minutes he was chained to the spot by the terror of the spectacle. The apparition was half lying upon the floor, with arm uplifted as if warding off a blow from some deadly instrument. Finally, in the desperation of his terror, Nelson called his partner to come to his assistance. Upon the approach of his companion, he summoned enough courage to step to the door at the other end of the cabin and try to open it. It was held fast by some superhuman agency, which allowed the door to be only partly opened. Swanson, at the sight of the ghostly visitor, was not so badly overcome as his friend, and having an inquisitive turn of mind, wished to find if the apparition really existed. He called out, demanding to be told who was there, but no answer came. Still the mysterious, unearthly noises came through the cabin door. No soughing of the wind could make such sounds had a tempest been blowing, but a deathly stillness prevailed, and no breath of air stirred. Then it was that Swanson gathered all that was left of his fast disappearing courage, and said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are you demon, man, or ghost?" Suddenly the door opened, and in the uncertain misty light, the apparition raised its hands to the stars as if in prayer. Then it grew dark, and the ghostly visitor vanished, as if the earth had engulfed it forever. While turning this tale over in mind later, I came to the conclusion, which seems a reasonable one, that some fortunate miner had, in all probability, hidden an amount of golden treasure in or about the cabin on the creek, and wishing to keep others away, had circulated the ghost story with good effect. When Eagle City was reached, I telegraphed my brother to meet me at the steamer's dock in Dawson, and my message was sent by one of Uncle Sam's boys in blue in charge of the office. The town had grown considerably in the 2 years since I visited it, and now boasted new government buildings, officers' quarters, and a Presbyterian church, besides new stores and shops. After Cudahy and 40 Mile came Dawson, and we steamed up to the city's dock in the morning fog, and were met by the usual multitude of people, I having been 17 days out from Golovin Bay. There, among others, waited my brother and his little son, and my joy at meeting them was great. Landing, it was only a walk of a few minutes to my kind old father, and my brother's wife was not far away. I was now practically at home, for home is where our dear ones are, and surroundings are matters of small moment. 3 happy weeks followed. I went everywhere and noted well the improvements in the camp since I last saw it. It was now a cleaner town every way, with better order, good roads and bridges, new government buildings, post office, and fine large schoolhouse. New frame churches replaced the old log ones in most cases. There was the governor's new palatial residence, which would never be graced by the presence of its mistress, as she and her babe had gone down to death a few weeks before in the islander disaster in Lynn Canal. And there was the same steady stream of gold from the wondrous Klondike creeks, which I was now determined to visit. One bright, warm day, taking the hand of the small boy of the family, my sister and I started for Bonanza Creek. We were bound for the house of a friend who had invited us, and we would remain overnight, as the distance was 5 miles. My kodak and 3 big red apples weighed little in our hands, and we turned toward the Klondike River in high spirits. For a mile the road was bordered with log cabins on the hillside, with the famous little river flowing on the other. We crossed the fine Ogilvy Bridge, and soon found ourselves upon Bonanza Creek, the stream which, with the El Dorado, had given to the world perhaps the major part of golden Klondike treasure up to this date. Following the trail by a shortcut, we crossed shaky footbridges, rested upon logs along the trail, and picked our way over boggy spots until our limbs were weary. Everywhere there were evidences of the industry of the miners. but the claims and cabins looked deserted. Only in a few instances were men at work near the mouth of the creek. Many people were going to and from Dawson, and bicycles and wagons were numerous. When we reached our destination, we had walked 5 miles in the hot sunshine, and were hungry and warm, but a warm welcome from Mr. and Mrs. M., as well as a good dinner, awaited us. After resting a while, we were shown around the premises. 3 log cabins were being built in a row upon the hillside, the one finished being already occupied by the M. family. Tunnels were being made in the mountain by Mr. M., as well as other claim owners nearby, and across the gulch, mining operations were in full blast. On the M. claim, preparations were being made for winter work, and it was expected that a valuable dump would be taken out before spring. For 300 feet, one tunnel entered the mountain back of the cabins, and we were invited to go into it. Putting on our warmest wraps, with candles in hand, we followed our guide, the proprietor, for some distance. It was like walking in a refrigerator, for the walls and floor of the tunnel were solidly frozen and sparkled with ice. Whether the bright specks we saw were always frost, we did not inquire, etiquette forbidding too much curiosity, but from the satisfied nods and smiles we understood that it was a good claim, though only recently purchased by Mr. M., a handful of pudgy gold nuggets being shown us which fairly made our eyes water, because they did not belong to us. Here we lodged all night, enjoying a graphophone entertainment in the evening. The next morning my kodak was brought out, and before leaving for home I had several views to carry with me. Our walk back to Dawson was much easier than the one out to the claim. From this on, we made ready to leave Dawson for Seattle, and were soon upon our way. Again I was forced to say goodbye to my father and brother, though they would follow us a month later, and together, my sister and I, stood with the little boy on the deck of the steamer, waving our goodbyes. We now traveled in luxury. We occupied a large and elegant stateroom, ate first-class meals, and had nothing to do but enjoy ourselves. To change from steamer to steam cars at Whitehorse, which was now a good mining town, was the work of an hour's time, while a day's ride to Bennett and over the White Pass to Skagway was a real pleasure. We found the quiet little port of Skagway swarming with people rushing for the steamers, and as if to give us variety, we had considerable difficulty in finding our trunks in the customs house, and in getting upon the steamer in the darkness of the late evening. But at last it was all successfully accomplished, and we took our last look at Skagway. 11 days after leaving Dawson, we reached our journey's end, and landed in Seattle, our homecoming being a source of delight to our dear waiting ones, as well as to ourselves. Our safe arrival being another positive proof of the mercy and goodness of God. End of A Woman Who Went to Alaska by May Kellogg Sullivan. This recording by Karen Commins. I invite you to visit my website at karencommins.com.